Hello, everybody. I'm Natalie Brunell. Thank you so much for checking out my show, where I get to hear from the leading voices in Bitcoin, financial markets, political structures, philosophy, and more. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show. And if you're watching this on YouTube, like this video so more people see it and hit that notifications button so you don't miss out on any new content. This podcast does not provide financial advice. It is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So make sure you always do your own research before making any financial decisions and be aware of your risk tolerance. I'm able to produce this show thanks to my sponsors, and I'm very picky about who I choose to partner with. So I hope you'll take the time to listen to the ad reads throughout the show. I'm also able to produce this show thanks to the support of my listeners and viewers, value for value. So if you'd like to make a donation to help the show grow, you can find my Bitcoin and Lightning wallets in the description. All right, now to my main partner, Swan Bitcoin. Swan is where I do all of my Bitcoin purchases. In fact, I dollar cost average every single day, not every week, not bi-monthly, every single day. I love Swan Bitcoin because it is a true Bitcoin only company. Swan has a ton of free educational resources on their website, and they now have a mobile app, which I've been using to smash by some Bitcoin. And Swan Studios produces my new show, Hard Money, which covers the biggest news in Bitcoin and the global economy. It's like an orange-pilled version of CNBC, so make sure to check that out on YouTube for all the biggest headlines, because we are not afraid to question the mainstream narrative. All right, it's time for the show. Thanks for joining me for another CoinStories Hard Money conversation. This week, I'm excited to be joined by Alex Epstein. He is an author, philosopher, and a leading expert on energy, and we're going to be talking about some of the impacts that fossil fuels have on climate. Alex, thanks so much for joining me.
Great to be here.
Well, first, as everyone knows, I like to start with your origin story. I heard that you're originally from Chevy Chase, Maryland, a very progressive area close to DC. So tell me a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah, I mean, I always find location to be sort of the least interesting, but I guess it's slightly interesting for me because I grew up in a place where you wouldn't expect the world's leading advocate of fossil fuels to have grown up. You'd probably think, oh, maybe they grew up in a place, a coal mining town in Kentucky, or Houston, Texas, the oil and gas capital of the world. In Chevy Chase, Maryland, it was actually called Chevy Chase before the actor, so it wasn't named after him. But it's a suburb of the DC metro area, so you can just think of it as the culture you get there is very similar to the culture you get in Washington, DC. And so I grew up, it's a very political environment. My parents are both sort of involved, they have friends in politics, this kind of thing. My dad studied government and this kind of thing, but they were very good actually at not imposing any particular political view on me. And I think that was a huge advantage because once I became interested in politics, which was actually quite late, I was open to the idea that I was open to multiple views instead of just the default of most of my classmates was, oh, you should be a Democrat, you should be a liberal, that's what smart people are. Also, my parents are Jewish, and so growing up in a kind of Jewish environment, that's another thing. It's like, oh, if you're a smart person, you're going to be a Democrat, you're going to be a liberal. And I didn't really grow up with anything. And then when I started to get interested in politics, two friends introduced me, and then one was a conservative, one was a liberal, and both were smart. So I kind of had the idea, oh, I can think about what I want, what I think is true.
Well, I know you were very interested in math and science when you were young. So what did you want to be when you grew up?
Let's see. So I wanted to be an athlete at first, and then that was clearly not in the cards at all. But if you look at my youngest essays, they're about I would love to be a professional baseball player. And I give very articulate reasons why, but I was not good at baseball. So that was prohibitive. And then I was very interested in practical stuff. So I wanted to be a businessman after that. And I always liked math and kind of science and computer science after that, but math the most. So I figured, okay, I'm going to be kind of a tech industry person. Although I'm born in 1980, so it wasn't as much of an obvious life plan as it is now. I think I went to one of the top math, science, computer science high schools in the country, and we were sort of just at the point. I mean, when I was a freshman, the internet came out.
Right.
So that a freshman in high school, the internet came out. So we didn't really have the idea clearly of being a tech entrepreneur. But as I sort of progressed in my teens, that's what I wanted to be. And certainly the last thing I wanted to be is somebody who talked and wrote for a living. I thought of that as not an admirable thing. So a lot of writers, they always wanted to be a writer. And of course, there are a lot of people who aren't writers who always wanted to be a writer, but I never wanted to be a writer. But then I ended up loving writing and ideas so much that at a certain point it was irresistible. But that happened when I was 20. But it was really hard for me to admit, oh, I really like this. I really like philosophy. I'm not going to primarily become a tech person. So That's just a weird thing, but I think it actually helps me because it makes me very practically oriented. And even when I create stuff in writing, I think a lot like an entrepreneur. Like I think of my book as this is a tool for explaining to somebody who expects to disagree that fossil fuels are good and who thinks fossil fuels are evil. It's like to take them step by step. Or I do stuff with politicians where I give them talking points and I like engineer it very carefully, like I would engineer, a computer program or a physical product.
Right.
So I think I still have that practical bent, and I have none of like, oh, I just want to be a writer who just says things and everyone loves me and I just express my spirit or something like that.
And neither of your parents worked in the energy industries.
No. I didn't know anyone in the energy industry. So my parents, let's see. So my dad is a political scientist, so he's worked at the Defense Department. He was an academic, and then he worked at the Defense Department. He still does. And my mom was a securities lawyer, and who retired recently. So they're sort of intellectual, but no. I mean, we never talked about energy. Nobody talked about energy. And even in high school, when I was at this prestigious high school, we only talked about what I would now call the negative side effects of fossil fuels. So we talked about fossil fuels are impacting climate and that's going to be bad, but there was no thought whatsoever of, oh, there are benefits to fossil fuels. There might be reasons why we want to continue using fossil fuels.
Right. So you were basically programmed by the current narrative that's out there, right?
Yeah.
And I understand you went to Duke University. Did you study philosophy?
Yeah. Well, so programmed is interesting. I think it was an environment that was sympathetic, that was trying to, but I would say I was not the most easily programmable person from a pretty young age. And it's hard to know exactly why that is, but that was just, I don't know. I was very into thinking for myself. And so it wasn't like I had my view on kind of climate catastrophe and stuff like that was not at all, it wasn't like, oh, I'm a Greenpeace guy and I totally believe this, but I was afraid of it. And like I didn't, but it also was associated with being anti-freedom. Like often people who are anti-freedom were for climate catastrophe or believed in that. And sort of when I was 15, 16, I started getting very interested in freedom. So first, like sort of identifying as a conservative briefly, and then libertarian. And then I got interested in Ayn Rand and started identifying as an objectivist. And then, so I had a very pro-freedom bent. And then the other thing is I really started hating the green movement. And I'm using that very deliberately, like hating, because when I was 18, I got exposed to a line of thinking from some like students of Ayn Rand who wrote about the environmental movement. And they made this basic point that the modern environmental movement, it's basically against human impact on nature.
Right.
And then the point they made is we survive by impacting nature. So it's just that juxtaposition of this is how we survive. And they say we should minimize that. This is an anti-human idea.
That's interesting that seed was already planted before you started even going in depth studying fossil fuels.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you though, because we are going to talk about Bitcoin at one point, and Bitcoin is money. Did you think about money when you were younger?
Yes.
Because obviously that also ties into everything related to the energy crisis and the cost of fossil fuels. So what did you think about money and how has that changed over the years?
So kind of my intellectual progression is I only learned really about energy when I was, let's say, 27. So, but I got interested in I learned about Ayn Rand and then Austrian economics starting at 18. So I basically had 9 years. I mean, I would learn about energy just very incidentally, but it didn't at all stand in my mind prominently. I didn't think much about the benefits of fossil fuels. I actually had stronger opinions about money. Because you kind of learn early, if you're in this school of thought, that there's this idea that you should have a gold standard. Obviously, I didn't conceive of a Bitcoin type standard. But when I did learn about that in 2011, I was very interested in it. Like I immediately thought it was a great idea because it made sense to me that, hey, fiat, like there's a fundamental problem with dictating money, which is our means, among other things, of indirect exchange, which is so important. And the idea that somebody's going to dictate this was wrong. And I was very open to, the gold standard worked a lot better. And once you debase the currency, it's a problem. And Ayn Rand has this great expression called the separation of state in economics, which I actually didn't understand for like 15 years what that meant. Because I thought it meant the separation of state and economy, which isn't quite the same thing. That's more of an anarchist view, which I don't have. But it's more like the state has no say over what is a good economic idea or not. And that especially applies with money. Like you don't want the state deciding, hey, this is a good attribute of a currency. We're going to control it. We get to inflate it if we want to pay for our welfare programs, or even we think it's in your interest to inflate it 2% a year. Like that should be totally up to private people. Same with healthcare, same with everything else. So once I learned about Bitcoin, and then even leaving aside the energy part of it, like I was very sympathetic. So I'm not somebody, like I come from a very, not originally, but I very quickly adopted a very individualistic, rational, like extreme in people's views, pro-freedom view. So that's one reason why I like love the idea of Bitcoin. And a friend of mine, Eric Dennis, who's a physicist and a finance guy, like he introduced it to me in 2011. I remember it was actually the night before. Some people have seen these videos. I counter-protested Occupy Wall Street. I don't know if you've ever seen this footage.
Wow.
In 2011. Yeah, Eric and I did this. It's really entertaining if you search for it on YouTube. But I believe it was the night before that he explained to me what Bitcoin was. And I had no money, unfortunately.
What was the price?
You would not believe it. I don't look back at stuff like that. But I thought of investing, but I didn't think about the financial implications. Like I just didn't think that through, and I know he was investing. But also, contrary to what people think, I had no money. People tend to think that, oh, if you're a fossil fuel advocate, you must have been groomed by the fossil fuel industry and showered with riches. And at this point, I was just starting my own entity, the Center for Industrial Progress. And like the idea was a pro-human alternative to the modern environmental movement. And by then I was pro-fossil fuels. But I like had no money. I mean, it's such small savings. So the idea of spending any money on anything other than my survival was just crazy at the time. But of course, if I had done it, yes, I would be, I would just buy out all the houses in this neighborhood.
I would have died to know about Bitcoin in 2011. I hope that I would have had enough of that risk-taking behavior to actually buy some back then, but I guess we'll never know. I want to ask you really quickly, before you started
When did you get into it?
I didn't know about it until 2017.
Oh, wow.
And at that time, when I did learn about it, I was so skeptical. I would have never put in the percentage that I have allocated of my portfolio and my worth that I do today. But I wanted to ask, before you started your think tank, philosophy as a major. If I went to my parents and said, I'm studying philosophy, they would have been like, that's not a real major. Pick something technical, law, medicine, something. So you're a philosopher. What does that even mean?
Well, so it's actually worse what I did, because I was a computer science major.
Oh,
so
okay.
I had to go to my advisor and tell him, like, I'm never programming again. I want to be a philosopher. So it was like I was somebody with the ability to do something very different. Like I would work at one particular software company. And so now by the way, I am much, much better at ideas and philosophy than I am at computer science. So it's not like the computer science world lost, a John Carmack or something like that in losing me. But nevertheless, this was a real career. Like I got real job offers to do software. But like for me, once I realized it, there was no question at all. Because actually philosophy I think of it as the most practical field. And this was very helpful. Like Ayn Rand was a huge influence in this, because this is a huge theme of her work. She has a book called Philosophy Who Needs It? And the idea is, well, everybody needs it. So if you think about philosophy, I think of as it's the study of the fundamental ideas that guide our thinking and our action. So fundamental means at the base, like at the base of everything else. And in Fossil Future, and I find it helpful to divide it into 3 categories. So one is thinking methods, one is assumptions, one is values. And we'll probably get into all of these when we talk about this issue. But hopefully people can just see at a high level, hey, the method that you think about something with, like that's going to affect how you think about it. And if your thinking methods are better, you're going to get a lot better results than if they're not good. And your assumptions, like what assumptions you have about how the world works, particularly about cause and effect, that's going to shape your expectations. That's going to shape your predictions. And so many bad ideas and bad policies in history are based on false assumptions, like about human nature, about the world, et cetera. And then the final one is values. So what do you think is good? What is the nature of the good? And one point Ayn Rand brought up is like, do you believe that every individual is obligated to sacrifice themselves? Do you believe the individual's life is of no value on its own and it should be sacrificed to some higher cause? Or do you think every individual's life is valuable to them and we should respect that and have individual freedom in politics? That's going to make a huge difference if you think an individual life matters or if you just think it needs to be sacrificed to something else. And so that kind of understanding, again, I didn't know anything about energy for a while, But thinking in those terms, I think once you're aware of thinking methods and assumptions and values, you can pretty quickly see the way we think about energy is really bad in all three categories.
Well, it makes so much sense why you wrote about the idea of a knowledge system. Who is informing us and who are our experts, which we'll get into. But I want to find out what did send you down that path of really studying fossil fuels to the extent that you have. You've done extensive research on all the different sectors within energy. We often conflate energy with electricity. So how did you go down that rabbit hole?
Of studying fossil fuels? Well, it was really kind of one realization about it, or I guess one realization of how important it was, and then two was how bad the philosophy was. So the basic realization, I mean, it's the whole story of how I came to it, but is basically that energy is the fundamental industry. So it's the industry that powers every other industry. And so the more what I call cost effective, so low cost, reliable, versatile, scalable a form of energy is, the more every industry can be more productive and the more we can be prosperous. So I just found very I love fundamental things. Like, remember, philosophy is a fundamental study, right? It studies the fundamentals of our idea, of our thinking and our action. And then money this is part of the reason why it's attractive to me and to others, right? This is the fundamental of an economy, right? This is the basis of how we save and how we exchange value. And then energy is the fundamental of the economy from a different perspective. It's like the physical fundamental, whereas, money is more like an evaluative fundamental. And so the idea was, well, if it's fundamental, that means the thinking about it is also fundamental. So good thinking about energy is going to lead to like a world of abundance and safety and opportunity. And bad thinking about energy is going to be really, really bad.
Right. Scarcity.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, mega scarcity, and a regression to the normal scarcity of nature, which people don't think about, but which is horrific. Just living in nature, and then living in nature with 8 billion people is impossible. So one thing is just realizing, wow, this is so important. The thinking about this is so valuable and so consequential. And then the second thing is the thinking is really bad. And this is where it starts to seem like, how could this one person be right when he's saying everyone is wrong, right? Because I really do think almost everyone thinking about this issue is wrong. But it's not that I think all of their facts are wrong. I think it's the philosophy, or you can think of it as the framework they're bringing to the facts. And so one basic observation that I made pretty early on is we don't follow the basic rule of carefully weighing both the benefits and the negative side effects of a technology or a product. Like, you do this with, you're considering an antibiotic. Obviously, you weigh the benefits and the negative side effects. Nobody disagrees with that. Yet with fossil fuels, we only hear about negative side effects and we don't hear about benefits, even though the benefits are huge. And you start to realize, wait a second, fossil fuels provide 80% of that energy that powers every industry. And then we have a world where people don't have nearly enough energy. 3 billion people using less electricity than a typical refrigerator, 6 billion people using an amount of energy that we would consider just totally unacceptable, like a poor person's level of energy. And fossil fuels are providing 80% of that, and they have despite 100 plus years of aggressive competition, and despite all this hostility, again, in a world that needs more energy, like, you start to think, we should be talking a lot about these benefits because the policies on the table are telling us get rid of fossil fuels. And yet we're not. And so that was like one huge flag. And then, these took a little more time to realize, but seeing, well, one assumption that people have in the criticism of fossil fuels and the idea of climate catastrophe is they're really treating the earth as what I call this delicate nurture. So this thing that exists in this wonderful, nurturing state. It's stable, doesn't change too much. It's sufficient. It gives us what we need as long as we're not too greedy, and it's safe. And then the idea is our impact ruins it. We are what I call parasite polluters. So we plunder the earth and we make it disgusting. We make it ugly. We ruin it. We destabilize it. And I just thought, well, these are not true assumptions about the world. And yet all the climate fear, I realized that after a certain point, like, a lot of the climate catastrophe is based on that. They treat the climate as this delicate nurture that was perfect until we ruined it. And then you do a little thinking, well, climate was horrific until we started mastering it. And then the final thing, which I really had the benefit of this environmental philosophy, is this issue of values, and realizing that, well, the top value of the modern environmental movement is something like an unimpacted Earth. Like, that's what everyone seems to be striving for. Like, with climate, Notice we don't strive for a livable climate. We strive for an unimpacted climate. We strive for net zero by 2050. That's the number one goal in the world. Think about that. The number one goal in the world right now by corporations, academia. I mean, I just got this crazy thing from Duke, and they just send me all these propaganda things trying to raise money. And it's like, our climate is now the center of all our efforts. But that means don't impact climate. So literally the number one, ESG, of course, this is the goal. The number one goal in the world is don't impact climate. It's not let's empower 8 billion people. It's certainly not let's have good money, right? It's not let's have global abundance and flourishing. Right. It's let's eliminate our impact on climate. And so my view is that shows that our focus is eliminating our impact on nature versus advancing human flourishing. In nature, that's a hostile kind of world. It's what I call wild potential. It has the potential to be amazing, but we have to impact it a lot. So seeing, hey, we're not looking at the benefits methodologically. We have this delicate nurture assumption, and then we're valuing eliminating human impact over advancing human flourishing. Like those eventually made me think, oh wow, there's a huge opportunity to rethink this. And the existing thinking is basically going to lead us to hell on earth if it's followed consistently. Now, bad thinking is never followed 100% consistently, but it gets followed really badly. So I don't have the comfort of, oh, these are just crazy ideas that people will abandon. Like people follow bad ideas really consistently. And as I think we'll talk about, we have an energy crisis right now, which involves people following them I believe 1% consistently, and it's still a disaster.
It's really interesting that you say that, because when I think of the green movement or people that are climate activists, you get this imagery in your head, right, of the planet being kind of hugged by hands, and everyone wants this to be a beautiful place for generations to come, but yet it's energy that has made the world a very livable place, because if you removed all of our electricity, all of our machinery, it would be a very tough place to live and to survive just for basic needs. So let's break down fossil fuels a little bit, because they are the leading source of energy around the world, right? More than 80% of our energy use comes from fossil fuels. So what are fossil fuels, and why are they the most reliable and the most cost effective?
Okay, so that's a good question. What are fossil fuels? And people don't even, my best friend is a teacher, and he's always pointing out to me, like, Alex, people talk about fossil fuels and they don't even think of what they are. So fossil fuels, you can think of them as technically refers to three specific stores of energy. So coal, oil, and natural gas. And these have in common, they're called hydrocarbons. So they're combinations of hydrogen and carbon atoms. And basically when you burn those things, so when you oxidize them, when you add oxygen into the picture, basically it splits them apart. And then the hydrogen attaches to oxygen and becomes water, and the carbon attaches to oxygen and becomes CO2. But then by splitting them up, you are releasing energy. And so the whole modern world is based on burning these hydrocarbons and then releasing energy, and then it leading to water vapor and then CO2. And then also, particularly in the case of coal and also oil, they're based on plants. That's another aspect. So, or life, let's just say, ancient life. And so sometimes they have things in them like nitrogen and sulfur that are connected to life. And so when you burn them, if you don't filter them, then that'll lead to certain kinds of like air pollution. At least in a certain concentration, we can consider it air pollution. So solid, you can think of as, rather coal is a solid hydrocarbon, oil is liquid hydrocarbon, and then gas is a gaseous hydrocarbon.
And they have a ton of energy essentially from the sun stored in them naturally. This is naturally occurring on Earth, and this is what we've harnessed.
So it's funny because it is natural and it's not natural. So the utility to us is not natural. Like these things were lying around doing nothing. Right. And when you used to discover oil, you would consider that often a nuisance. Like, oh, maybe you wanted salt water or something like that, and there was oil and it was a problem. But yes, in general, they have this natural property. Once we can understand the physics of it and we can engineer ways to exploit it, they concentrate a lot of energy in a small amount of space, or in the case of gas, in the small amount of mass. So gas takes up quite a bit of space, but it's very light. So in all of them, they store a lot of, it's called energy density. They store a lot of energy in a small amount of mass. And then with coal and oil, it's in a small amount of space. And then gas, we can compress it or liquefy it. And this is two aspects of that are important: the storage and then the density. So the storage, I think, is the most underrated aspect of modern forms of energy. And it's particularly relevant when you think about solar and wind, because solar and wind are flows of energy. So they're not like a battery that is just available to be released.
Right. They're intermittent.
They're intermittent and they're flows. If they weren't intermittent, I guess it wouldn't be a problem because then they'd just be constantly flowing. But yeah, they're intermittent flows. And so versus fossil fuels, nuclear, and in a certain way, hydro, particularly with a dam, they're a store. And so what you do is you just release it. And you can just release the store of energy. And so it's in effect, nature made a certain kind of battery for you. Nature did the work of farming and storing the energy for you, and then you release it. And what's noticeable is basically every cost-effective form of energy involves naturally stored energy. So you think about fossil fuels, they're all naturally stored by ancient geological processes. Nuclear is naturally stored in the nucleus of an atom. Even hydro, what happens is nature evaporates water from the bottom of a river, in effect, and brings it to the top of a river. Right. Like it stores it for us. Imagine we had to carry it up the river in buckets. It wouldn't be cost effective. Right. Even biomass, which is generally we object to it, like wood and animal dung, those are forms of nature concentrating and particularly storing energy. That's why people will burn down forests if they have nothing else at their disposal. So it's very important that they store, and then also they store it in a very dense way, because the more dense things are, one thing is that's just better economically. The smaller the space, the less mass you have, the better, all things being equal. And then particularly for oil, it's magical for transportation, because whenever you're doing anything with mobility, you have to carry your weight with you. You have to carry your fuel with you. And therefore, the more dense the fuel is, the more that you can do. And the more you're doing something like a cargo ship or an airplane or something like that, the more you need something very dense, and even something like a battery becomes a huge problem.
Right, and transportation uses so much energy around the world. Yeah. In your book, you said fossil fuel energy is low cost, on demand, incredibly versatile, and on a scale of billions of people in thousands of places. Can you talk a little bit about all the ways in which fossil fuels are used to power different industries? Because I mentioned earlier, energy is not just electricity. Right. There are so many uses that people don't realize. I mean, there are hydrocarbons in pretty much everything around us, right?
Yes.
Our cars, these chairs we're sitting in. So talk a little bit about what fossil fuels are used for.
Okay, remind me of the hydrocarbons in things if I forget, because that's a really important point, but I might forget. So the main point is how versatile hydrocarbons or fossil fuels, I'm using them interchangeably, are in terms of powering machines. And what's brought to mind as we're talking about this is there was a prominent Washington Post headline in the last week or two that was something like, hey, renewables to overtake coal as world's leading source of energy by 2027. And a bunch of people reach out to me and say, hey, is this really true? Blah, blah, blah. And this was the Washington Post. And I checked, and this was not a misheadline, because the reporter shared this headline very eagerly on Twitter. Okay, but there are many problems with this, but one is coal is not the world's leading source of energy. Oil is the world's leading source of energy. Coal is the world's leading source of electricity, but electricity is only 1/5 of the energy. And so you see, even at the level of the Washington Post, their reporter, they don't even know this. They use energy and electricity interchangeably. Yeah, and you think like that's not valid. This is 1/5. It's not even. It's 90%, right? And so the issue is electricity. There's reasons for loving it. I mean, electricity is unbelievable. It's an incredibly precise form of energy. So, for instance, like we can record. Electricity opens up, particularly electronics, open up all of these things that we couldn't do with anything else. But there are a lot of things we do where electricity is either impossible or it is cost effective. Because with electricity, what you need is, if you're going to take it in a portable way, you need some sort of battery or some sort of battery equivalent. And if you want to use fossil fuels, if you want to avoid fossil fuels, you basically need batteries or hydrogen, which leads to its own problem. So that is
like our cars, like our ships, like our planes, essentially.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. So for transportation, there's a reason why oil totally dominates transportation, because it has this amazing what's called energy density, both its mass and in particular its volume. It's also very stable. Like it's a liquid that's very stable at a very wide range of temperatures. And so that's why all the cargo ships are basically powered by oil. And all the planes are basically powered by oil. So many things in terms of transportation, particularly heavy-duty transportation, are oil. And even with light-duty transportation, so even with smaller cars and trucks and stuff, there's still huge advantages of oil today compared to electricity. And as somebody who's currently in the market to buy a car, I actually don't drive, but I have a great assistant who drives me. I know how to drive, but I haven't driven in a while. We're looking for minivans, and it is crazy. I mean, in part just because of the whole supply chain crisis, which is caused by statism, but like there's a million EVs on the lot, and like you can't get there's so many like oil powered vehicles that you just cannot get. Like you cannot order them to spec at any price right now. And part of what people have all these forcible reasons to go to EVs, but like there's like a high-end van or something like that, you want the density of oil because it just allows you so many things. So oil is this magical thing, and that's why it's so dominant. So obviously for heavy duty, but also for many other things. So
you mentioned thermal too, right? So transportation, it does power electricity,
right?
But what else?
So I categorize. You can categorize energy use in different categories. The four most helpful for me are transportation, or like liquid fuel for transportation, electricity, and then what I call industrial and residential heat. I mean, other people call it this as well. So industrial heat is very high amounts of heat for industrial purposes. So you think about steel making plastics, like a huge number of things that we do in civilization involve generating very, very high amounts of heat. And not almost always, but very commonly, the most cost-effective way to do that is by directly burning a fossil fuel versus generating electricity. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because if anyone knows basically like how electricity is generated when you're using heat, so when you use nuclear or when you use any fossil fuel to generate it, what you do is you generate a huge amount of heat, and then it uses a form of what's called a heat engine. There are different kinds of it, like a steam engine and an internal. There's different kinds, like a gas turbine. But it basically, that one works a little differently. But like the main engine's like a gas turbine, and a steam engine. The heat turns a turbine. So the pressure from the heat turns a turbine, and then that uses what Michael Faraday discovered about electricity to turn a magnet and turn it into electricity. And this is amazing. But you can imagine it might be more efficient to just use the heat. If you want to generate heat, don't go through that whole process to generate electricity and then turn that into heat. Just use the heat directly. So much of modern industry involves burning fossil fuels directly. And if you had to burn them indirectly or use anything else via electricity, it wouldn't be cost effective. So for example, hydrogen is a really interesting thing, because everyone talks about, hey, we need hydrogen fuel, right? Like this is supposedly this new panacea that people are focused on. But by far the cheapest way to produce hydrogen is burning natural gas. Wow. People talk about what's called green hydrogen, which means using solar or wind, but that has to get an enormous subsidy to the point where just the subsidy they get under the so-called Inflation Reduction Act is twice the normal market price using natural gas. So that's like we gave gas stations, if gas is $4 a gallon, that's like we gave gas stations $8 extra a gallon. Right. That's what we do, because fossil fuels are so cost effective for producing hydrogen. And then there's residential heat as well. What is the best form of residential heat? It's usually natural gas, because natural gas burns very cleanly. And when we have enough freedom of production, we can get it cheaply. So you just burn this thing directly, again, versus burning it in a power plant to turn a turbine to generate electricity and then using an electric heater. So we have fossil fuels, they dominate. They're by far the leader in electricity, but they're even more dominant in industrial heat and transportation, and they're quite dominant in residential heat.
All right, so we're going to move in a moment to renewable sources of energy and the economics that you just mentioned. But one last thing I want to touch on when it comes to fossil fuels is, in your book, you show charts of, as our use of fossil fuels is going up, so are things like life expectancy, aspects that are really directly related to prosperity. People are living longer, people are living healthier lives, they have more access to things like sanitation and water and machinery that powers their lives. So can you talk a little bit about how fossil fuels have impacted our lives over the last, say, 100 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think so I have a whole chapter on this. I mean, I have many chapters, but chapter 4 is like the longest chapter of the book. It's some crazy number of pages, like 90 pages just for one chapter. And because I think that almost nobody gets how valuable fossil fuels are. I mean, in a sense, it's how valuable cost-effective energy is. But as we're discussing, nothing is close to fossil fuels. So today, cost-effective energy basically means fossil fuels. Without fossil fuels, we wouldn't have cost-effective energy. And in fact, every single form of energy we use today depends hugely on fossil fuels, including nuclear in various ways, certainly solar and wind, et cetera. So I think the best way to think of it is to recognize how bad life is without energy in general, and then fossil fuels in particular. And I mentioned that we're taught this delicate nurture view of Earth, where Earth is just, it exists in this delicate nurturing balance. And so it's going to be stable, sufficient, and safe. And what we have to worry about is disrupting it with our impact. As long as we don't disrupt it, it's going to be pretty nice to us. Now, this is such a widespread view, but it is absolutely insane because we have all of history to show us that this is not remotely true. So Earth is actually wild potential. So it's actually dynamic, deficient, and dangerous. This is how life actually works. And so the question is, how do you have a world of abundance in a world of wild potential? And the main answer is productive ability. We have to have the ability to produce new value. One is we have to overcome the natural deficiency of nature. We have to be able to bring new value into the world. And we have to be able to overcome the natural danger of nature. We have to be able to produce value that neutralize and defend ourselves against all the threats. Even something like fence making is like a huge achievement that people couldn't do in the past. And so we need to be productive to overcome our naturally deficient and dangerous planet. But then we run into the problem of we are weak. Like we are physically weak, no matter how strong you are. What's that? Exactly. Yeah. So you spoiled it. But yeah, no. we need machines. Exactly. So as long as we live a manual labor life on a naturally deficient and dangerous planet, life will be terrible for the average person. What people do historically is they try to overcome that by exploiting large numbers, usually by force, large numbers of individuals. But this is not a solution if you care about human flourishing in general, to say, oh, well, I'll just be king and then I won't have a problem. So what do? We invent this amazing thing called a machine. And what a machine does is it allows us to do work, but we don't have to do it with our own manual labor. The machine can amplify our ability, or in the case of a robot, it can just do it on its own. And so machines have two great things. One, I mentioned, they amplify our ability. So like take a really good manual laborer at reaping and threshing wheat. He can do 1,000 times more work if you put him on a combine harvester, and a really bad manual laborer can do that too. Mm-hmm. So, and this sort of gets to, it expands our abilities. It allows us to do things that we can't do ourselves. And flying is one of my favorite examples. Like we can't get together, everyone in this room, or even everyone in this neighborhood and say, hey, let's fly, right? No number, or more, maybe a more immediately life and death example I use a lot is an incubator. So let's say, one of us has a premature baby. It's not like the neighborhood can get together and just be a physical incubator for the baby, even if we want to. Of course, we couldn't do it also because we wouldn't, if we're in manual labor, we need to spend our time just getting our food, making our shelter, et cetera. But machines allow us to expand our productive abilities. And so we go from this deficient and dangerous planet to this abundant and safe planet. But it all depends on the ability to use what I call machine labor, machines doing work for us. And that totally depends on how cost effective energy is. Because the lower cost, more reliable, more versatile, more scalable energy is, the more we can use machines to produce value for us. Mm-hmm. So if energy becomes half as expensive, we can use machines way, way more because we can use the machines we use more, but then also every machine that produces every machine is cheaper. So when you think of like how much does my food cost and how that relates to the price of energy? Well, it's the fuel that the tractor uses, that the combine harvester uses, but also the fuel that the factory that made them uses, mm-hmm. and the factory that mined the materials, and the factory that processed the thing. So energy is everywhere. So that's why I say the more energy we use, the more livable the planet is. And that's why I'm so I'm so aware of most of the world doesn't have anywhere near the level availability of cost-effective energy. And then also we should be really afraid of losing it. People are afraid of impacting the climate. That's kind of the number one fear. They're afraid of, well, what if it becomes 1 degree warmer? What are we going to do? And we can explore that. My main thought is what happens if energy becomes twice as expensive? Mm-hmm. Then what do you do? Because I know what that means. I mean, that's a regression to manual labor. Right. And I'm very aware we're in a world that's artificially sustained by fossil fuels. So the world is actually a delicate nurture, but not in the way people think. It's delicately nurtured by freedom and by fossil fuels. And you could argue by, to some extent, sound money as well. But you think about if we lose freedom to produce value, and if we lose the energy to power the machines, we have 8 billion people on a planet that was bad at sustaining 200 million people. Mm-hmm. That's what you should be afraid of, is the machines not working. Because these machines are really they're really our saviors. Mm-hmm. They're really keeping us alive. And we should really have gratitude for them and the energy, because everything depends on those machines.
Well, and you've touched on why those inputs that rely on energy, the costs are going up right now as we've really impacted the supply chain because of what we're doing with energy policies. But, what was interesting reading in your book was how poverty has really, really been reduced over the last 100 years. But there are still 3 billion or so people who don't have access
so there's
to energy.
There's extreme poverty. So we just have to be careful. So like most of the world, like let's just say 3/4 of the world, if we woke up in, we would think it's the apocalypse. So it's just like when we talk about extreme poverty, this is less than $2 a day.
Right.
So just think about what that means when you're budgeting. Less than 200, I mean, this is less than $800 a year. So this is like extreme poverty. And so I was born in 1980. It was more than 4 out of 10 people at the time who were in extreme poverty.
Now it's
1 out of 10. So that's like probably the fastest increase in wealth in human history. And one thing that's notable is we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it, and we have no interest in the cause. And it's interesting we don't talk about it, but you would think, well, everyone who claims to care about the state of the world, wouldn't they be so interested in the state of poverty? And wouldn't people be knowledgeable? And I cite a survey of college-educated adults in the UK about, hey, what has happened to the state of extreme poverty? And I think that in this case it was the last 30 years, but it's the same trend. And 55% said it had gotten worse. So you've got something that's gotten miraculously better, and they think it's gotten worse. Like college-educated adults, and something like 33% thought it was the same. And just barely over 10% thought we're right about it. So you have no clue about how much more livable the world is becoming for the typical person. And then in part because of that no interest in what caused that. Because my view is we have this magical increase in the livability of the world, and then fossil fuels powering what I call machine labor is a root cause of that. And nobody is interested in that. And then as we'll talk about probably later, this is also corresponded to a dramatic reduction in the death rate from climate disasters.
Right.
So we've just had this amazing improvement in the world that I believe is fundamentally driven by fossil fuels. And nobody even knows about the improvement, and nobody knows what the cause is. And yet our leading focus as a society is destroy the cause. But it's not thought of destroy the cause. It's like destroy this devil or destroy this alien evil force. And so let's just eradicate the fossil fuels, and then we get to live in this perfect world. Versus no. Insofar as the world is perfect, it's because of those fossil fuels.
Right. So just to clarify, poverty has gone from 4 out of 10 on the planet
extreme poverty
to 1 out of 10. However, 3 billion people still live on less electricity than one American refrigerator.
Right.
So we still have a huge issue. And I would argue that here in the US, I think a lot of people would say poverty is increasing because we're crushing the middle class. The rich are getting a lot richer. It's something that we talk about with Bitcoin, obviously, a lot. But in the grand scheme of how people lived on this planet, things are getting better and better. And a lot of that is the result of low cost energy fossil fuels is what you're saying, right?
Well, and in particular, though, right now we're in an energy crisis. So the dynamics you're talking about are real. I think there are a lot of interesting dynamics I'm sure you've gone into in terms of how unfair so-called monetary policy is, how much it benefits certain groups, how much it exploits other groups. So there are real dynamics there, but we're really having, with the COVID lockdowns, the anti-fossil fuel movement, and the global energy crisis, we are really having a regression. And so fossil future, like I have numbers, most of my numbers are through 2019, and that's very deliberate because once you get to 2020, you sort of you're introducing all these new dynamics. So in terms of understanding the role of fossil fuels, it's not really helpful to look at 2020, but now you're seeing 2021, 2022, by suppressing the supply of fossil fuels, we're having this dramatic increase in the cost of fossil fuels and also other forms of energy, which depend on fossil fuels. Plus with these like lockdown anti-freedom mentality, we just have this global supply chain crisis that is absolutely insane. I don't mean to keep coming back to this, but like I'm just shocked you cannot order a car. There are many cars you can just not order in this country. I hadn't tried to order a car for a while, but like I was just like, what country is this that you can, like they have a website that says, hey, this is the car, this is how much it costs, and you cannot buy it from them. It's just like so we are really having a regression. And I think that is an important thing. So it's true fossil fuels have made the world amazing. But my whole argument is if you take away freedom in general and the freedom to use fossil fuels in particular, you can have regression. It's not this Pollyanna view that you get progress no matter how irrational you are. Because if you restrict the freedom that progress depends on, then you get stagnation and then you get regression. And certain people are most affected by that.
Okay, I want to shift over to talking about renewables because that's the focus of so many of the current policies.
Right.
ESG, maybe you can kind of shed light on what your thoughts on ESG are, but renewables, they are what, 3% of our energy use, most of which is electricity. So give us the landscape. Renewable energy, most of us understand that to be solar, wind, nuclear on that list, but not invested in or not?
No, it's not on the, well, it's important. So one thing is one thing you get from philosophy, or I think people should get from philosophy, is terminology. And like when you hear terminology, when you hear new terminology, particularly if you have a pro-freedom bent and you think it's being used to oppose freedom, be suspicious of the terminology. Unfortunately, like historically defenders of fossil fuels, including like the industry, like their approach is instead, whenever anyone in our enemies introduce new terminology, let's just use it. Let's just accept it. So let's run down the list. ESG, sustainability, renewables. And people, if they notice me, like I'll never use any of their terms.
Okay.
Like I don't use the term renewables, I don't think once, except in quotes, in scare quotes in it, because it's not a legitimate concept and it's used to obscure bad stuff. So why is it an illegitimate thing? Well, one is what counts as renewables? Really only two things consistently count as renewables. Those are solar energy and wind energy. Hydro is explicitly excluded from many, many classifications of renewables. Well, that's odd, right? Because why is hydro not renewable? The sun evaporates water, brings it to the top of rivers. Why is that not renewable? It's based on the sun, right? But it's because the green movement is opposed to hydro because they think it has too much impact on nature. Okay, but so what it really means, what renewable and green really mean, is whatever the green movement wants to oppose right now. So it's really a religious concept. It's not a scientific or a technological concept. And then even if you did include hydro, so you say, okay, I'm going to be a more purist about renewables, like there's no such thing as renewable because energy is a process, and there's no such thing as renewable because everything runs out, like even the sun runs out. But forget the sun running out, all the elements used to produce so-called renewables are not renewable. Right? All of the elements involve all these metals and stuff. So basically everything we do involves transforming non-renewable things in finite ways. But what we do is we gain knowledge. And so we figure out how to transform more and more things into value. And so the goal is not to be renewable, which really means repetitive, or sustainable, which means repetitive. The goal is to be evolving or progressive. You want to just find new and better ways to do things. You should always do the best thing now and then find better and better things. So it's not unsustainable to use fossil fuels if we, quote, run out of them in 200 years. It's progressive or evolving. Because there's no sense in saying, let's suffer now. Let's use this crappy source of energy because we can do it forever. Like, why would you want to do something crappy forever? You don't want to do it at all. So let's use fossil fuels and then nuclear fission and then nuclear fusion and whatever else we can come up with.
Well, the big push with renewables is that they don't emit the CO2, right? But they do rely heavily on fossil fuels in order to produce these solar farms and wind farms, right?
But interestingly, it's sort of on not emitting CO2, but notice the green movement is very hostile to nuclear, and as I said, it's very hostile to hydro. So I think this is a giveaway. It's not really about the CO2, because if you were obsessed, if you loved energy, loved human flourishing, and were super concerned about CO2, then you would say, I want to find the best possible ways to produce energy without the CO2. And you would be rabidly enthusiastic about nuclear, because nuclear has actually demonstrated the ability to produce low-cost, reliable electricity at least, but also we use it, we have a nuclear navy. Like we use these we use these reactors in nuclear submarines, and there are nuclear icebreakers that people use in the Arctic. So we have nuclear aircraft carriers. So you would just have this obsession with nuclear like we had in the 50s and 60s. Like, let's use nuclear as much as we can. And yet the green movement is almost categorically against it. And they've regulated it to the point of criminalization, where it's 10 times more expensive than it used to be. So it's important. Like, the reason I'm harping on this is because my theory is that the CO2 issue is not a sincere interest in protecting us from one side effect of fossil fuels. It's part of a broader hostility toward everything that impacts nature.
Okay, I want to come back to the CO2 when we talk about climate in a moment, but just since you touched on nuclear, we heard a headline recently that there was, some innovation that happened with regards to fusion
yes.
ignition, right? Tell us a little bit about the power of nuclear, why it has been criminalized, because immediately when I think of nuclear, I think of, the disasters that have happened from Chernobyl to Japan, and so there is this sort of negative narrative out there, but it is the cleanest source of energy, as well as it has the best safety record, right?
It's the safest by far. Yeah, so it's so sad when people say this is what I think of first, and then they'll refer to these disasters. Chernobyl's in a bit of a different category, but even that is not a disaster that like kills it's just a tiny blip in the Soviet Union's terrible history of coming up with things that kill people. So there's one economist, this isn't a real statistic, but I love this statement by economist George Reisman. He said, I'm sure that more people died from Soviet toasters than from Chernobyl. And the idea is the Soviet Union ruined everything. And so there are different, some people say hundreds, some people say thousands of deaths, but this is from a reactor that was like a quasi weapon that was not even contemplated in the United States. So you can just put this under, okay, this is one irrational thing the Soviet Union did. If you look at what the free or semi-free and civilized world has done, we haven't had any deaths from the radiation from reactors. So if you look at, say, Japan, you can call it a disaster, but nobody dies from the radiation in that disaster. People actually die from the evacuation, sometimes evacuating people too quickly. But actually, we should be looking at it as we actually found a way to generate energy that has almost no threat of death to neighbors. And that is totally unprecedented. We don't have anything that's close to that. You can have a dam break and kill 100,000 people. You can have all sorts of plants catch fire, even with solar installations in the home. You can have fires that are really, really hard to put out. You can have wind turbines go out of control. Nuclear is uniquely safe. So that I don't see it as, it's not as dangerous as you think. It's actually the safest and it's the cleanest. And it comes down to basically generating energy with radioactivity. And this is called fission. We can talk about fusion. So what you're doing is you're basically splitting the nuclei of atoms, which hold an unbelievable amount of energy. So then you're releasing that energy. And you can think of it as this has, at least theoretically, 1 million times the energy density of oil, which is the leading form of energy in the world because of its energy density, as well as you can burn it in a stable way. So
with no emissions.
Yeah. It emits radiation, but not in an amount that is harmful, assuming you do just basic things to contain it. So people would, it doesn't go that far and you can contain it in different ways. So people would always ask me, hey, Alex, okay, you say you would support nuclear, but you would never live next to a nuclear power plant, would you? I'm like, of course I would, because it's a lot safer than the thing I live next to right now, which is a street. Right? It's way more dangerous than a nuclear power plant. So basically by generating energy this way, the basic thing is it's like fossil fuels. You don't burn it, but it generates heat. It can generate really large amounts of heat, but without particles that we can inhale or that can get in our water. So it doesn't have the pollution danger. And then it can't explode. That's the other thing.
So why isn't the green movement moving toward nuclear? Why have they chosen solar and wind?
Well, ultimately, I think it's because they're not for energy. And that we can get into fusion. I think fusion really, really proves this. But it's because, so if you look at when nuclear emerged on the scene, there was this idea that it's energy that's too cheap to meter. This idea of it's going to be, or in particular, electricity that's too cheap to meter. So the idea is your electric bill is basically going to be nothing. That would be
nice.
Yeah, that would be nice. And now they're talking about it with fusion. So I think it could be a lot closer to that had they not criminalized it, but it didn't really make sense the way it was set up. But nevertheless, what the green movement thought, now you might think, well, energy that's too cheap to meter and that doesn't have pollution and that doesn't endanger people, I mentioned because it doesn't explode. So anything that goes wrong with a nuclear power plant is not only very, very rare, but it's very slow moving. So meltdown, what's called a meltdown, moves very slowly compared to a dam bursting, which is just immediate. And then you're done. So the danger to neighbors, besides pollution of an energy production facility, is like a sudden accident, and nuclear doesn't have that. So you would think they would love it, right? Except if people internalize what we've said so far, and I talk about in Fossil Future, which is the green movement is really an anti-human impact movement. So it's not a movement that desires abundant energy and clean air and clean water. It wants those in a trio. It views human impact as as really an immoral phenomenon. It views the best Earth as the Earth that would exist if we didn't exist. And so when there was this idea of too cheap to meter, the environmental leadership hated that because they hated the idea of us using a lot of energy. But think about it. If you think, like, let's say you really internalize the belief that human impact is bad and we should have as little of it as possible. And let's just say, let's take fusion, right? Let's say fusion can actually give us this unlimited, cheap, clean energy. Would you want 8 billion people to be using fusion? And let's say they could each use 10 times more energy than we use now. Would you want that?
I mean, I would. But...
No, but if you had this belief, you wouldn't, because we would have so much of an impact on the planet. Because what we do with energy is we impact things. This is why green energy is, I think it's such a perverse idea. Because energy is impact. It's literally the capacity to do work. And you measure that as force times distance, but it really means how much you can move matter. So the more energy you use, the more you move things. And so you just logically, if you are against human beings changing things, like, building roads, factories, farms, etc., like building spaceships, like we're going to do way more of that if we have more energy. Now, also we can actually also preserve nature much better. But we do it from a human perspective. We don't just say, hey, the earth, like we're going to preserve it all from us. We just want it to all be a quote national park that we never visit and don't touch. No, we're going to enjoy it. So we love polar bears. So we're going to make sure we have plenty of those. But we're going to actually visit them, and like we have safaris. It's like that's a pro-human love of nature, which I have and which many people have. But that's not the green view. The green view is we just need to leave it wild, and we shouldn't impede, and we should be as like minimally impactful as the other species. And if this sounds crazy, it's already been demonstrated. I talk about this with fusion in Fossil Future, because one of the last times people thought, hey, fusion is coming soon. It's not coming soon. It's like they have a technical breakthrough or research breakthrough. That's not the same as a commercial or economic breakthrough. But in 1989, there was this story in the LA Times that interviewed leading environmental thinkers about, hey, what happens if fusion comes? And the leading environmental thinker of the last 60 years, Paul Ehrlich, whom I talk about a lot in my book, he described giving fusion to human beings as like giving an idiot child a machine gun. So because of what we would do with it. That's the idea. And Amory Lovin's the leading like green energy thinker, not the leading green thinker. Like he had said of like this would be the worst thing that could happen to the earth because of what we would do with it. So it's an anti-energy movement.
But yet abundant energy would bring so many people who are living on, very little means and almost no energy to a place where they could prosper and they could create more productivity for their communities.
But that's considered bad. But that's antithetical to the earth. So the concept of the earth, when people talk about the planet from the green perspective, you can think of it as a dehumanized planet. That's the goal. So you're looking at it in a pro-human way, which I appreciate. I do too. But you're looking like, look at how good the earth could be for all these people that it's not very good for. But their view is, no. Look at how much humans will be imposing themselves on the earth. We don't want those people in the Gambia to have, to have electricity, to have incubators. Like, we have too many people. That's the view. Like, we have too many people doing too many things, and the real idea is we need to be like them, right? We need to be poor, and really it means there need to be far fewer of us. And this was very explicit in the 70s, and then the Greens realized this wasn't good marketing. So they've sort of backed off the overpopulation rhetoric, but the logic is obvious.
It is really interesting because I had never heard about that idea of human flourishing when you look at energy, when you look at sources for energy. Just to touch on renewables for a little bit more, can you talk about just how wide that gap is in terms of being able to shift over, right? Leapfrog all the way to solar and wind?
I realized I got into this philosophy and started attacking them philosophically for 10 minutes, but I should address the solar and wind. So I just talk about them as solar and wind, and then sometimes I call them, which the advocates hate, unreliable. So I don't use renewables, but I sometimes use unreliables. Because really solar and wind are being singled out, and that's the thing they have in common, is that they are not reliable sources of energy in general.
But they do rely on fossil fuels to produce them, right?
Well, everything unreliable relies on things that are reliable. So they're primarily producing so one is they primarily produce electricity, which, as we've talked about, is currently just a relatively small fraction of the world's energy. But then two, they are not capable of producing the world's electricity on their own. There's this huge dependence on fossil fuels. And with electricity, it's really important to recognize Like the modern electric grid is one of the greatest achievements in human history because what it does this crazy thing. Like electricity is this magical form of energy that we have, but it has this issue where you need to use it instantaneously. That's like its defect. It's not a stored thing. You need to use it instantly. And yet, think about what we have. We have the ability for all of us in the society to use instantly the amount of electricity that we want, no matter how much or how little it is. Just think about that. Like you go to a movie theater and they're using it, or you can charge your EV and you can use it. And
we take it for granted.
And most of the time it works. Mm-hmm. So what happens is like nobody can control or should control the demand for electricity. And yet we have the supply that always adjusts, and it needs to adjust very precisely. That's because we have a controllable supply of electricity. So the whole modern grid relies on a controllable supply of electricity, which has historically been based on stores of energy. This is why storage is one reason why storage is so important, particularly in the realm of electricity, because stored energy allows you to have highly controllable electricity. So what solar and wind are is they're uncontrollable electricity. You can also call it unreliable, that you cannot rely on. When they are available is not within your control, and the amount that they are available is not within your control. So how can you possibly get reliable, controllable electricity from an uncontrollable source? Theoretically, the way you would obviously do it is you would have so much of this uncontrollable electricity, and you would just have almost a limitless battery that you would store it all. And so for not just a rainy day, but a cloudy day, or not exactly the amount of wind you want day, you would have it available. But this is just bizarrely cost prohibitive, which is why nobody has done it and nobody's even considering doing it. Nobody likes this, but nobody who's an Elon Musk worshiper likes this. I'm an Elon Musk. I have mixed feelings about him, but his worshipers hate this. But if you run the numbers to back up 3 days of the world's energy use at Elon Musk's best mega pack prices is $400 trillion. So that's many times global GDP for batteries that would last 10 years. So this is just a total crackpot thing. So in practice, how do you actually use these unreliables? Is they totally depend on fossil fuels or nuclear or on hydro, but in particular they depend on natural gas because natural gas is the most flexible thing. So in practice, what happens is you depend on them. And then what happens is you need to build both the reliable electricity infrastructure, the controllable one, and the uncontrollable one. And if you try to get away with not having as much controllable electricity, which is what we've done here in California and what Texas did, then it's what I call reliability chicken. You're trying to get away with this little reliable electricity, and then you hope the sun shines enough, the wind blows enough, it doesn't get too hot, it doesn't get too cold. But so what you have is you have general increase in prices because you have the duplicative infrastructure, and you have decreases in reliability because you're trying to avoid the duplicative infrastructure.
Yeah, well, that was what I was going to ask. Is this mismatch between essentially the supply of energy versus the demand what causes the prices to go up? Because I know that renewables, they rely so much on government subsidies. And I didn't know, you pointed out in your book that battery electric vehicles, EVs, which everyone is being pushed to buy and drive, they began in the late 1800s. Yeah. But fossil fuels outcompeted them for cost and reliability.
Yeah, I mean, it's still happening. Now, EVs are the kind of thing like, I think your audience should be able to appreciate this. It's really like, we shouldn't have the attitude of, oh, these new things people are proposing, like they're all crap and like we shouldn't be open to them, but we should absolutely oppose people being forced to use them. So if EVs are such a great idea, then why do you need any government preferences at all? So I'm all for people being able to use EVs, but they have to prove themselves cost effective to different consumers, including they have to prove that there's enough electricity for them. We've got this terrible trend of we're reducing the supply of reliable electricity, and then we are talking about dramatically increasing the demand for reliable electricity with EVs. And now people are talking about the Tesla Semi, which is like, that's basically using a battery that's 10 times as big as the biggest Tesla auto battery. And like, there's just nothing to charge these things on a large scale. And again, we're reducing the supply of this. So it's just a perfect example of coercion and why we need a separation of state and economics. Because these idiots who are the idiots / people who don't really care about energy are saying, hey, let's use solar and wind. Let's use a lot more of that. Let's shut down the reliable plants and let's have everyone on EVs. Like, it makes no sense. Now, if you think you have a great way of doing it, prove it on a free market. But they don't want to prove it on a free market. They want to force it on us And we're seeing this in California where, I don't know if you saw when Newsom announced no more internal combustion engines by 2035. And then 5 days later, his government says, don't charge your EVs, right? And we have 3% penetration. So we have 3% EVs.
Right.
So it's part of the reason I went into the philosophy of this is because this motivation for, quote, renewables forced on us, it's not that they're so damn good at producing energy and everyone's so excited. If that were true, just prove it on a market. It's that there's a hostility toward fossil fuels in particular, but really industry in general. And this is a way of people claiming green energy is amazing, is a way of people getting away with opposing fossil fuels. Because if you said to people, hey, we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, we're going to rapidly eliminate them, and your life is going to be absolutely terrible because there's no cost-effective replacement for the foreseeable future, very few, particularly American voters, are going to sign up for this. But if you say, we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, but I've got something even better. It's amazing. You just use the sun, and you just use the wind, and it's free and forever, and you can feel good about yourself, and you just charge your EV, you just put on a couple solar panels, it works brilliantly. Like, then it doesn't seem like there's a cost.
Right.
To
That's
the
how a lot
policy.
of people, I think, look
Of
at this
course,
whole
yeah.
space.
Yeah.
Well, this is a good time to, shift over and talk about the energy crisis for a moment, because there are countries in Europe you talk about that are leaders in solar and wind, and they've only seen the cost of energy and electricity shoot up by 3-4 times. You mentioned that some days German solar and wind, they're leaders in the EU for renewables. They generate less than 5% of the needed electricity for the country. So we're in the middle of an energy crisis. Cost of all of these commodities are going up. Russia, I believe, is the biggest oil exporter and producer. So talk to us about what caused that energy crisis and why the policies that are currently in place or that politicians are trying to put into place, why they're moving us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, well, so there are at least two different dynamics here. Both are important, but one is the green energy movement increasing costs through what I call infrastructure duplication costs. So when you look at Germany paying way more for electricity than us historically, like it's even more exacerbated today for reasons I'll get into, but that's a lot of these infrastructure duplication costs because they really prioritize reliability. So they've basically built two grids, a reliable grid and an unreliable grid.
Wow.
And you have to pay for both. And in a sense, they're a leader at using it, but it is very important for security purposes that China is totally dominant in producing this stuff. So if you're concerned about Russia exporting oil and depending on that, that's nothing compared to what China has in terms of control of the so-called renewable market. So that there's these infrastructure duplication costs that make electricity a lot more expensive. But
you're referring to China producing the parts, the essentially the equipment needed to create solar and wind?
So there's a lot of elements. So everything has a supply chain, and the two most relevant elements are the mining, where they do a lot of mining, but also they procure a lot of the mining around the world through different initiatives that they have. But then really the processing, so taking mined materials and turning them into like a usable form, that is totally dominated by China.
Wow.
And in the US, because we have this prominent green movement that's hostile to development, hostile to impact, it's almost impossible to do mining or build, these kinds of factories, which is another proof that the green movement they're not interested in even the forms of energy they claim to care about, right? Because otherwise you would say, let's open up all of America for mining because we need all these elements for solar and wind. And let's build all these transmission lines and let's do all this development. But it's an anti-impact movement. So all those things have impact. So it basically means let's farm it out to China and they'll use a bunch of slaves and violate all the environmental standards. But it's out of sight, out of mind, except if it becomes practical, they'll oppose it. This is the secret. The green movement only supports imaginary energy. So if solar and wind became practical, they would totally, they would oppose it. And even fusion, a lot of them now are pretending, hey, we're so excited about fusion. But if fusion became practical, the Greens there'd be so many people against it. There are people who've already declared they're against it. But yeah, it's really important they don't support real energy. So we're talking about Germany. I just mentioned it's a China-centered supply chain for solar and wind. But the real thing that people don't get, so they say, hey, we caused this energy crisis because we forced all this uneconomical solar and wind. Actually, the main cause of the energy crisis is not that. It's that the claim that this unreliable solar and wind could replace fossil fuels, that caused us to reduce the supply of fossil fuels and make the prices skyrocket. So when you're having this energy crisis, it's overwhelmingly a fossil fuel supply crisis. There's growing demand and we don't have enough ability to supply fossil fuels. Now, it's not a physical constraint. It's like almost unlimited fossil fuel in the earth. Like we have so much of it. I talk about this a bunch in chapter 5, just the amount of this raw material there is in the earth. And it's not a knowledge thing. We didn't forget how to do it, but it's a political thing, right? We're not allowed to do it. And you mentioned ESG, but you can think of it as there's hostility at every phase of the productive industry for fossil fuels. So you can think of ESG as part of the hostility toward investing in fossil fuels. So you think about how much harder it is to have a gas project or an oil project, or God forbid, a coal project, right? There's so much hostility toward those.
Even though China's making more coal factories than anywhere.
Right. But even they can't, China is not going to be able to compensate for a global attack on this. So they have to pay higher prices too, and there's all kinds of issues. Yeah. They are not renouncing coal, quite the contrary. They're doubling down on it. So you're right about that. But it's so hard to invest in it. It's hard to produce it, like to set up, new facilities. I mean, we've seen with the Biden administration opposing it, but there's just opposition all around the world to new development. Then refining facilities are really hard to do. And then transportation is a huge bottleneck. Like in the United States, we have almost limitless natural gas, but we're basically not allowed to build pipelines. And it's really hard to build what's called liquefied natural gas export facilities. So you have this systemic attack on fossil fuel supply in a world with growing demand. And so that's the real thing. The green energy movement's greatest sin is not foisting us with this expensive, duplicative, wasteful green energy, although that is a huge sin. It is depriving us of fossil fuels and making that go way up. And the biggest perversion here is now the green energy movement is saying, hey, look, fossil fuels are expensive. See, we told you so. We told you renewables are great. And I call this the Tonya Harding case against fossil fuels, because it's basically saying, I don't know if people still know the reference, but Tonya Harding, the ice skater, like her cohort attacked Nancy Kerrigan, and then she couldn't compete. And so basically the green energy movement is like Tonya Harding, crippling the fossil fuel industry and saying, hey, you can't compete. Except here, the fossil fuel industry is still out competing green energy. People still need it. They're just willing to pay these crazy prices. That's why we're willing to now go to Saudi Arabia, to Venezuela, to beg for it. Right? I mean, everyone is desperately wanting fossil fuels. Biden isn't saying, hey, China, ship us more solar panels as quickly as you can to overcome. Like, everyone wants oil. Everyone wants the good stuff. But because we've so suppressed the production, that we've suppressed the supply, we have an energy crisis. It's number one, it's a lack of fossil fuel crisis caused by the anti-fossil fuel movement.
So how much have we reduced our fossil fuels over the last few years versus how much have prices gone up?
So we haven't reduced our fossil fuels at all. So this is the scary part, is the green/anti-fossil fuel movement. And it also often goes by the net zero movement. Their goal has been to radically restrict fossil fuel use already, but they haven't restricted it at all. It's actually at a record high. What they've done is they've slowed the growth and we have more demand. So they've caused a crisis just by slowing the growth, but they want to get rid of it in 27 years. So that's what just drives it home for me, is just by slowing the growth of it, you cause a global energy crisis. And so many of the people are unrepentant. They're just like, oh yeah, we got to do this faster.
Is that deadline doable at all?
Well, I mean, there's no way I can say this and people will take it seriously, but basically, like, if you killed everybody, yes, that's the only way.
So you're saying that in order to be net zero by 2050, which is, I believe, the WEF's goal and the IMF's goal, you would have to kill everybody on the planet, is what you're saying. Yeah. That's pretty extreme.
I agree. That's why I don't agree with the goal.
Okay, well, so...
But it's like, I mean, people can read Fossil Future and see, and I mean, the only thing, here's where I could be wrong, is if you had a really cheap way of capturing CO2, that would be the only way that is conceivable to me. Because you just look at the landscape of things that we have. I mean, like solar and wind are already like hugely problematic. They're not at all progressing in the way people hope. They're not like replacing fossil fuels, they're just creating a whole bunch of new problems. Nuclear is amazing in terms of its potential, but it's stagnating and in many places regressing around the world. Like, we don't have anywhere near the policy changes that we need for this. And I'm working really hard on changing that myself, but it's just people have no idea. Like, I've been in this 15 years now, so since 2007. Like, and in 2007, everyone's talking about, oh, solar and wind, they're just around the corner, they're going to replace. Like, this is 15 years. 15 years is a long time. 27 years is less than 2 times 15 years. So people don't understand how quickly time goes by and how much time has gone by as these different targets have been made. So they're not all based on careful thinking about energy and human flourishing. They're just based on the desire to eliminate fossil fuels. This goal came from activists. It didn't come from any serious. It came from activists who are hostile toward energy and hostile toward human impact, and ultimately hostile toward human life.
Well, and any fossil fuels and the reduction of energy sources by the Western countries like the United States and countries in Europe, it's been offset by how it's increased in places like China and India, right? So we really aren't making that much of a dent as far as global emissions.
Yeah, well, and we shouldn't. I mean, even part of that is people say, oh, China uses so much coal, damn China for using coal. But a lot of that is us using coal because we're producing our stuff in China. And then we're delegating it to China because it's cheaper. But part of the reason it's cheaper is because of coal.
Okay.
So but also like when people think, I hate when people ask this question about, oh, can we do this goal? Because why is this our goal? Why should our goal be eliminate our impact on climate by 2050? Again, it should be global energy abundance, global human flourishing. Like climate should be such a derivative issue. Why do people think, look, we've been emitting CO2 with fossil fuels for 170 years. Life has gotten amazing. We'll talk about we're safer than ever from climate. Why should we assume that the next 20 years of this, the next degree of warming is going to be the apocalypse? When 1 degree plus all this energy has been amazing, why is another degree plus all this energy going to be the apocalypse? Doesn't make any sense.
Well, let's talk about that now. The climate crisis, the catastrophe. There are folks out there who basically sometimes make it seem like within the next couple of decades, we're going to have sea levels rise to a level that it's going to destroy cities and communities. We're going to kill off all the polar bears. We're not going to be able to sustain life in parts of the world. So I want to talk to you about the science because it seems to have changed. And maybe the first place we'll start is your knowledge system, the people who are informing us in the media as well as policymakers. But you talk in your book about examples in the 1970s, New York Times, The Guardian, Newsweek, headlines that are predicting global cooling, in some cases an ice age. The Guardian, 1974, space satellites show ice age is coming fast. All of a sudden, now we're talking about global warming. So tell us a little bit about, first of all, who's informing us and where are they getting their science? And then maybe what is the science of climate?
So there are some people, and like if some people watch this who are kind of climate catastrophists, they'll be really mad at you right now and by extension me because it's like, oh, that global cooling thing, like nobody ever believed in that. But I talk about that's actually why it's important, because it's not true that most scientists believed in catastrophic global cooling, but it is true that that's how it was portrayed to us by trusted institutions. And this raises the issue of the knowledge system, which is really based on how do we actually get what we regard as an expert knowledge and guidance? Like, how does that relate to the people who are actually doing the specific research? And there's a whole discussion of this in chapter 1 and in the rest of the book. But I think for our purposes, it's very important that it is possible for what the researchers say. It's true that can get distorted on its own. That's a hard thing. But even if the researchers are totally right, their views can be totally distorted to either be a total contradiction of what they say or to lead to actions that they would not possibly support. So in the case of global cooling, what happens is, well, let's say that you have, I categorize there are researchers. So researchers do the basic specialized research. They're what are called synthesizers. So they take that enormous amount of research and they decide what's most important, what's most accurate. And that's hugely error prone. Like even if all the research is right, the synthesis can be wrong. And one of my criticisms in climate science is the syntheses of what's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They ignore the fact that we have rapidly decreasing climate-related disaster deaths, and they ignore the role of fossil fuels in protecting us against climate disasters, which is crazy because fossil fuels are obviously crucial in terms of irrigation and heating and cooling, building sturdy buildings, et cetera. So synthesizers can screw up. Then there are disseminators, which you know the most about, right? Because you've been in the world of journalism. The reporters, the anchors. Right, and so they're taking like the synthesized knowledge, and then they have to further synthesize it and essentialize it, and that can just be totally butchered.
And they're not experts.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. So they're trying to synthesize the expertise. So that's hard to do. And then there can also be motives. They can also have their own motives. And, you know, this is a cliche, but I think it's true. You can refute me. But like a lot of people go into journalism to change the world. Like they go into journalism for reasons of values which means they want to guide people in a different direction. Then that can be dangerous in terms of, are you telling them the accurate thing about this, or are you telling them the thing that you think is going to drive the action that you want? And sometimes it can be subconscious, sometimes it's conscious.
Interesting.
But there's huge distortion possible at the synthesis level, the dissemination level, and then the most distortion is possible at what I call the evaluation level. So evaluation means once we have whatever we regard as knowledge, and again, it can be very distorted by the system, what do we do about that? So let's say we discover, for example, that fossil-fueled climate change is going to lead to a 10% increase in drought. Like, what do we do about that? Does that mean get rid of all fossil fuels? Not necessarily, right? Because it could be, well, fossil fuels help us neutralize drought through irrigation, through transporting crops and that kind of thing. And they also have all these other benefits. So it could be we should be using more fossil fuels, even if they do increase drought, because the benefits far outweigh the negative side effects. But what can happen is evaluators, unless they're using a really good method of evaluation, they can do things like what I've mentioned. They can ignore the benefits of fossil fuels. So when you hear the climate, the 70s example is a good example of like the disseminators really failing. And so what they did is that there was a general hostility toward industry that was emerging with the green movement. And people loved stories that, like, disseminators loved stories about we're ruining the earth. And so the earth was in a bit of a cooling phase at the time. And so people who thought that was a catastrophe and the solution was to reject industry and kind of de-develop, those people got undue prominence. So there's a guy named Steven Schneider, for example. I talk about him in Fossil Future in chapter 2. Like, he got huge prominence from the New York Times. Is this because he's the best guy in the field? No, but it's because he's the guy who's telling the story that people want to hear. And you can think today then with global warming of, yeah, I do think it is warming, but who is being selected to represent the researchers? And I call these people designated experts. Who are the people that are selected? And my argument is that the knowledge system picks people who, A, catastrophize the negative side effects of fossil fuels. So who, insofar as there are negatives, they exaggerate them and they ignore our ability to mitigate them or neutralize them. And they also ignore the benefits of fossil fuels.
Well, I find this very interesting because of my background in media and journalism. I was a reporter and a news person for more than 10 years in the legacy world of media. And we have a saying in that world, if it bleeds, it leads. And what it refers to is this idea that the story, if it doesn't have controversy and conflict, it won't get the views and it won't get the reader or viewer attention.
Do they actually use that in the industry? I've only heard it
in the TV industry. Yeah.
Oh, they do? Okay.
If it bleeds, it leads. Yeah. It's something that I learned all the way back to in journalism school. And again, but what's interesting about it, and maybe you'll find this interesting as a philosopher, is it plays on the idea that we as humans are voyeurs and we want to look at the car wreck, right? We drive by, we all slow down and there's traffic because we all want to see the accident. And there have been experiments done in my industry where they tried to put on a newscast with all positive stories and no one watched. And so, I mean, it killed the audience essentially. So
I would love to see that. I've never heard of those.
And honestly, when reporters would try to do more feature-y stories, including me at some points in my career, I wanted to do lighter, more feel-good stories because obviously I would prefer something like that to be surrounded by as my environment than, let's say, a crime scene, a murder scene, a natural disaster, which I was constantly covering. And again, those stories made it towards the end of the newscast because whatever has the most strife, controversy, conflict, drama, that's what leads. That's what leads. Yeah. So it's interesting because, if you did look at every headline, let's say I was a reporter, whether I'm in a news market or as a student, and you're out there searching for a story, unless there is that inherent conflict, you're not going to be allowed to cover it. So you have to present something that is a problem, essentially. You have to cover a problem and then you cover the two sides of that problem. So here we are, and we have a major problem. That problem is supposedly the climate. It is a catastrophe. It is a crisis that we need to address right now. So I want to ask you first, just directly, do we have a climate crisis?
Well, can I say something about the journalism thing?
Sure.
Because I think one implication people can draw is, it's inevitable that they'll do this kind of thing. Like the journalists will be drawn to this climate crisis narrative. But I think it really depends on their assumptions about the world and also their knowledge or non-knowledge about energy. Because from my perspective, what would get my attention is a story about an energy crisis, right? So
Right.
what really causes people to bleed is lack of energy.
Totally.
So it's interesting how, and you can think of this from a freedom versus statism perspective. Like from a status perspective, oh, you need to tell the story about the person suffering healthcare wise because of the failures of capitalism, right? But from a freedom perspective, is no, you need to tell the story of the person suffering for lack of freedom, and there should be those stories. So all the assumptions that people have in their worldview, that affects like what people will be afraid of, because part of the it bleeds, it leads. It's interesting, the voyeurism aspect of it. There's definitely a fear aspect, and I don't know how they integrate or relate exactly, but it is like fear is a legitimate thing. I mean, it's really bad to exploit.
You can prey on it
but
so easily.
But it's a legitimate thing. I mean, you think about, there is a sense in which death is more bad than any part of life is good.
Right.
In the sense of, and I don't mean that in a holistic way, but just moment to moment, like, okay, if I die, it's over, right? That's it. Versus, like, oh, I live and then I live forever or something like that.
Yeah.
So people, they have a reason to be afraid of things. So they want to know, like, fear is a valid thing if there's an actual threat. Now in the modern world, we just screw it up totally because we're afraid of all of these things that our ancestors wouldn't think of as a threat at all. And perversely, let's go into climate crisis. We're afraid of climate, even though we are safer from climate than ever. And this is very revealing. I think it's very revealing of just how miseducated we are and how bad our leadership is. So let me just ask common sense, like even before you had read my work. If I just asked you the question, hey, Natalie, would you rather be, I know you're not supposed to do this in interviews, but would you rather be alive? Like, do you think you're safer from heat waves 100 years ago or today?
Today.
It would be obvious, right? What about winter? Safer?
Safer today.
Right. Storms.
Safer today.
Floods.
Obviously. It's common sense.
But everyone thinks we're more endangered, right? And I even thought this, despite all the things I had going for me, I thought for sure we're more endangered by climate.
Right.
And then I got exposed to this literature, or rather this data, of climate-related disaster deaths. And there was a researcher named Inder Goklani who I first saw it from him, but there's just this international disaster database, and they just catalog, they have this database of.
It's like a hockey stick down.
Yeah. It's like a really strong downward trend. And you see these deaths going overall down by 98% over the last 100 years, which means a typical person is 1/50th as likely to die from a climate-related cause. So you think, like, even just there, we're less likely to die from climate than ever. And then it clearly, if you think about it for a second, like, again, we don't think of this on our own, but if you break it down, it seems common sense. I'm like, hey, Natalie, is it relevant that we used fossil fuels to heat homes? Has that kept us safe from climate? You'd say, obviously, yes, right? What about air conditioning? Fossil fuel air conditioning, right? What about irrigation powered by fossil fuels? What about building sturdy buildings? Like, all of these things are obvious, like, it's obvious, but nobody thinks about it. And I think this goes to, like, how distorted it is and how much we accept this delicate nurturer thing, but then also how our knowledge system is a failure. Because what our knowledge system does is it constantly gives us examples where our sins against nature via fossil fuels have led to some climate disaster. They say nothing about the benefits of fossil fuels in neutralizing climate disasters, and they don't point to, with any given disaster, hey, this would have been far worse in the pre-fossil fuel era. So you think, oh, we've added this alien, unique thing, this unique danger to the world caused by fossil fuels. And if only we withdraw the fossil fuels, the climate will hug us and smile at us again. And it's 180-degree false, but it just shows you how warped, like, the system we rely on can be.
Well, it's interesting you made the analogy earlier, that idea of looking at just the negative side effects versus the benefits. So, if we were to look at the patients that had negative side effects of something like penicillin, which has really transformed the world in a positive way, we didn't even look at the benefits at all, but we focused on the instances where something negative happened. That's what you're essentially saying is happening with climate. So to answer the earlier question, do we have a climate crisis?
No, we have a climate renaissance. So it's actually the best time we've ever experienced climate-wise. And the one thing, penicillin is a good analogy. I happen to be allergic to it. So, like, I'm a perfect example of, if people only looked at, the Alex Epsteins of the world who got an allergic reaction when they were 3 or 1 or whatever. But there's a distinction, though, between fossil fuels and penicillin with regard to side effects, because penicillin cannot cure its own side effects. So I can't take more penicillin and then whatever rash or I forget whatever happened, like I can't cure that, but fossil fuels can actually cure their own side effects because energy can cure the side effects of energy because energy can do anything basically. So you take the example of, I use the example of drought, right? So if fossil fuels can cause more drought, which in general is actually dubious because when you make the world warmer, it's a wetter world, but just leave that aside just as an example, as a hypothetical, like they can create more drought, but they can also alleviate drought through irrigation and through crop transport. Or they could create more heat waves, but they can also make our world much more livable heat-wise by giving us air conditioning and shaded areas and that kind of thing. And even if you think about air pollution, like let's say a really high concentration of air pollution can lead to some increased incidence of cancer. But if that's happening, you also, the energy can, have much better hospitals and much better drugs and make your life overall longer, which is part of the reason why you have skyrocketing life expectancy in China. And people have these crazy stats that say like 8 million people a year die from fossil fuels, or like 2 million people died in China from fossil fuels. And you look at fossil fuel use in China and life expectancy, and it's way up. And yet they're saying the fossil fuels killed the people. It's again the benefit denial. They're only looking at negative side effects and not benefits. And one thing to note is whenever somebody only looks at negative side effects and not benefits, or more broadly, when they only look at negatives and don't look at positives, you can be pretty sure they're exaggerating the negatives. So you imagine you see a couple or something like that, and somebody is complaining about the mother-in-law and saying, like, this is the worst mother-in-law ever, like, I hate her, blah, 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 blah. And you learned, hey, the mother-in-law bought them $1 million house. And the guy doesn't mention that. Well, then you can, anything he says negative about the mother-in-law is probably exaggerated because there's clearly a bias. So the same bias that leads you to ignore the benefits of something vital, if you know them, if you're an expert, is going to lead you to exaggerate the negative side effects.
Okay, Alex, but what about the polar bears and what about the pollution?
Okay, those are both interesting categories because neither of them should be a primary focus with climate. So people often, they're very sloppy in the thinking about this. So I think when you raised the common way of thinking about this, you said something like sea levels are going to rise and destroy our cities. And then you said something about polar bears, and then you said something vague. And this is a perfect way, which our knowledge system, it's a perfect summary of our knowledge system, how it portrays it, right? This is what they do. But wait a second. If you're really thinking about your top, and this coming, by the way, from someone whose favorite animal aesthetically is a polar bear. But if you're thinking about the worst things that could happen to the world, and polar bears are really at the top of your list, that's an interesting thing. The city's getting submerged and not having polar bears. Most people never see a polar bear. It's just what it shows is we're not clear in our thinking. Are we optimizing for human flourishing? Which I would argue that has some role for polar bears in it for sure, but it's not one of your top issues in a world where almost everyone is poor. We need to think of this all the time. We are very rich here. No matter how poor we feel in America, we are very rich. Most of the world is desperately poor, and they want a good, healthy meal. They want some kind of decent healthcare. They want some kind of decent education. All of those are at stake when we talk about fossil fuels. So when people say, hey, there's a crisis, and polar bears are in their top 2 or 3, it shows there's something distorted. They're not looking at the benefits of fossil fuels. And also maybe it's not such a crisis if that's their leading example. And so then how could we be, so you said, what about the polar bears?
Well, I think about the polar ice caps that are melting because these are those visceral images they show on media as well as in documentaries like Al Gore's, right? You see the polar caps melting, you see the nature, the animals essentially dying, they're losing their environment, and then you understand the idea of sea levels rising as a result, right? And everything is kind of attributed to fossil fuels, energy. We are bad, we're destroying the planet.
Right. It would be really interesting to do a documentary of 10,000 years ago when you're having far more melting and disruption of environment. Because I show, and you can look at this up in Wikipedia, but sea level rise right now is really slow. So if you look at the history, looks like this and kind of tails off. So it's interesting where people are, I think they're focused on it because we did it, because we have actually very slow sea level rise right now. It's slightly faster probably than it was 100 years ago. So I do think we contribute to it, but there's nothing in it that is on a scale that is actually a scary thing from a human flourishing perspective, and nothing resembling the benefits. Nothing resembling what even we're experiencing with the energy crisis, which again is only 1% of the anti-fossil fuel agenda. So, you could look at, the polar bear is kind of a funny thing because if you really care about a species, and you are rich, you have much better ability to deal with that species. And for various reasons, we care about polar bears. And polar bears are way more plentiful than they were when Al Gore began talking about this. There's some meme, which I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like, when Al Gore was born, there were 7,000 polar bears. Now only 42,000 remain. Because they've just increased so much in quantity. That's why they stopped using them, by the way.
Wow.
Like if you care about any part of nature, you want people to have a lot of energy, because if you have a lot of energy, you have a lot of wealth, so that you can actually preserve the best parts of nature. The sea level is actually a plausible thing, but it's just notable to me how people are so obsessed with the polar bear thing. And again, they're not thinking about billions of people in poverty. And it's not like you actually need to kill the polar bears. Fossil fuels can actually allow you to have more polar bears, but it's just revealing that that's the focus of they don't have a human focus, and they also might not have very much evidence if they need to go to polar bears.
Well, what about the pollution? Because when you talk about mitigation for things like drought, I see it very differently than something like pollution, where you're basically saying, well, there will be better hospitals and medication, right? I don't want to have some sort of a pollution-related illness. So can you talk a little bit about the impact of, say, our energy use on pollution, and how you see that moving in a positive direction, when I think a lot of the net zero movement is really about tackling that, right?
Sure. I'm glad you raised a good objection to what I said, which I appreciate, but just think about it in the context of like fire. So like when fire sort of came on the scene, what would you think about? Like, would you think, so in some way you have more of a pollution risk to your life, right? You're inhaling smoke and stuff like that, but fire is fundamentally transformative of your life. Like it has these huge benefits. And so you're deciding, hey, fire is going to allow us to keep warm. It's going to prevent us from the constant danger of cold, which is a way bigger danger to human life than inhaling X amount of smoke usually is. And it's going to allow us to actually have food, more reliably through cooking. And it's going to allow us to control the forest more and stuff like that. So you really do have to think like health is something that we have to produce. And I think people have the delicate nurture view, particularly with pollution, where they don't think about all the natural danger that exists. By the way, there's tons of natural danger where we live in California. And when people used to visit California, they'd just be talking about the smoke all the time, because the forest would always be burning down. And the forests are a huge natural health hazard. So we do have to recognize that there are trade-offs between like your productive ability to produce health and negative side effects from that. Now, ideally, you want more productive ability and fewer negative side effects. And fortunately, that's what we can do more and more using fossil fuels. We can burn natural gas, which is super clean on its own. We could burn oil for electricity, but we don't, because it's just expensive. But coal we can burn quite cleanly now compared to what you used to be able to do. So you can have places that have quite clean air and that burn coal. And so it's not, when people have these images of pollution, they just think like, oh, I'm constantly living in smoke and stuff. And it's really like, it's nothing compared to what smokers take in during their life. Nothing compared to that. So but yeah, you want to minimize it, but you want to minimize it as part of maximizing human flourishing. And you just think about having a child, and like you think about the real options at somebody's disposal. Like it really is life or death if they have heating in the winter. It is really life or death if they have a hospital, if they have an incubator, if they have other kinds of prenatal equipment. Like these things are life and death, and many people will absolutely accept a little bit more air pollution to have that. I mean, that's why people move to cities. So I just harping on this because I do think people underrate the massive natural health danger that exists, and the huge role that industry plays in making us unnaturally healthy.
I have to say that one of the most interesting things I learned from reading your book and the statistics that you cite is that today's CO2 levels are less than 1/10 of the planet's historical highs, which were some of the most life-friendly times in the Earth's history. So we used to actually be warmer. That was actually a more conducive environment for things like plants and vegetation, for fertile soil. And you mentioned also that when it does warm, when the planet warms, it gets warmer first, concentrated in the northern polar regions in the winter and at night. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, man, you did a good summary. Of that. This is I think one of the most powerful points about climate, and it's in a section of the book. It's something like why an unlivable planet is impossible in terms of emissions, because we're taught, our emissions are going to make the planet unlivable. And yet one thing you'd want to look at is, okay, if we were truly an unprecedented territory, so we had never had CO2 levels like this, that would be a different category than if you're on a planet that has had CO2 levels that are 10 times higher. Now, you mentioned it was warmer. Actually, sometimes it correlates well with warmth, but sometimes it inversely correlates. So It's not like a perfect correlation at all. So I do believe that CO2 is a driver, but also temperature drives CO2 as well. Like when you warm it. Yeah, exactly. So you have, but in any case, if you just think about it and you don't have the bias against human impact that so many of us are taught, including I was taught, you just think logically, like if we just put more, if nature put more CO2 in the atmosphere, like how would we feel about it? Would we feel totally negative, like it's the apocalypse? Probably not. I mean, definitely not actually, because one is we would know that it would have a massive fertilizing effect. So it would make it a lot easier to have plant growth around the world because CO2 is plant food. And that's been a huge thing. The earth is far, far greener than it was when I was born. And it's far greener in places that no humans have been. So it's not just that we have a gardening effect or a farming effect. It's just there's a lot more plant growth because of the CO2. And then with the warming, even just on its own, you'd think, okay, well, some places are going to be warmer and that'll be better. And some places are going to be warmer and that'll be worse. But I noticed pretty early on, why don't people talk about the benefits of the warming, even though like a lot of people die from cold. And then you learn, wait a second.
More people die from cold.
Well, yeah, then you learn, I'm just saying the common sense. Then you study it and then it's, wait, more people die from cold. And then you learn that warming is concentrated more in cold places, which means even more cold-related deaths prevented relative to heat-related deaths caused. And then you learn it's more in winter and it's more at night where the warming is. So it's more about the world becoming less cold than more warm. This is why the focus is such in the Arctic, because the Arctic is warming more. But that is vastly preferable to the equator warming more.
Wow. Well, as we start to wind down, I want to come back to Bitcoin. You said you learned about it in 2011. Very, very jealous.
Very little.
I guess you didn't buy in at that point.
I bought none.
When did you first buy in?
A couple of years ago.
Okay. So Bitcoin is very tied into this energy debate. The White House actually put out a report just a couple months ago on the impacts of Bitcoin mining on the climate. Unfortunately, it cited people like a Dutch central bank blogger instead of actual scientists or people within the industry. So there are a lot of us that are passionate, who are Bitcoiners, who want to get the right factual information that's out there. Mm-hmm. Some of that information is good. Some of it needs to improve for sure. But I just wanted to get your take on Bitcoin mining and its tie to energy use, because one of the things that I think climate activists are going to use against Bitcoin is this energy narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really simple. I mean, I think that the world should always be aspiring to use more energy. I mean, what energy is really, you're using machines to improve your lives by producing some new form of value. And what I've always thought about Bitcoin is, wow, this is a very cool form of value. And if it works out as planned, like it's an amazing kind of achievement, but it's certainly something people should pursue. And I get why people are excited about it. I'm excited about it my own way. I mean, I'm not excited about it to the extent that it's my life, but it's something that I like and value a lot. And so I think like this is a great way of using machines to produce value. Here, what you're trying to do is produce like a uniquely valuable currency that has never existed. And I mean, anything I could say about the value of Bitcoin, everyone would know, but it is, I remember the first thing my friend pointed out to me was like, gold has a kind of value of the asset itself, but it also has this exchange value. And like, you just think if you can really limit the supply of this digital thing, like the exchange value is way better because it's so easy to move around. And like, I got that early and I thought, this is great. Again, I should have invested even the no money that I had at the time, because I didn't think through like what would actually happen if this worked, or even if it worked on a much larger scale. Right. For me, it was just as a pro-freedom person, I just liked the idea. I wasn't thinking of it as an investor. And that's still mainly the way I think about it, as this is a good thing. But if you think of Bitcoin as really, really valuable and using a lot of energy, you should think of it as this is a really good use of energy, and you should be proud of that. And then the question is it good to use energy? And I would say yes. And is it good to use energy if the energy has some negative side effects? And I would say yes. I mean, that's what we do constantly. Every single person in the world, in the wealthy world, is constantly using energy that they believe has some kind of negative side effect, even if they're not climate catastrophists. But they say, well, the benefits are worth it. So what I've seen with the Bitcoin community, there's a hazard where what some people have jumped on is they said, no, wait a second. Bitcoin is not going to use any more fossil fuels. Actually, Bitcoin is going to get rid of fossil fuels. And they come up with some calculation that somehow Bitcoin is going to reduce the use of fossil fuels. And I just don't believe that, even remotely. And I've had some really interesting discussions with, I don't know if they want to be named, with people lately, but I've had some since we discussed it. And one person in, actually, I'm sure he wouldn't mind. Parker Lewis and I had a good discussion about this. So if you want to, maybe we'll share sometime what the discussions we've had. But I think he's somebody, when we've talked, at least, I don't know what he says publicly, but we've talked privately, he's made a lot of sense. And I'll just tell you my view, which is like anything that uses a lot more energy for the foreseeable future is going to increase fossil fuel use. Now, I do think Bitcoin also has the potential to be a great way of exploring alternatives. In part, you can use different isolated locations. You know, people are
stranded
investigating.
energy.
Well, there's stranded energy type applications. There's also, there are certain people exploring like ocean thermal, what they call OTEC type things. I think it's plausible.
Flared gas.
Yeah, well, flared gas. So that's kind of a waste product that you're turning into value. And that's a good thing. I mean, to me, the most exciting is people trying to create different kinds of nuclear reactors in semi-isolation, like to find what is the place that's most amenable to having the freedom to build nuclear at the cost you could actually build it. And then, connecting that to Bitcoin mining, because that's really appealing. So I do agree that Bitcoin has huge potential to foster certain kinds of innovation, and that's exciting, but that's different from saying, hey, Bitcoin is actually reducing our emissions. It's not going to, and it hasn't. It's increased our emissions, and that's good. I mean, that everything that uses energy increases emissions. Like there was this one thing people were publicizing for a while about something like 76% is renewable, and then that was actually a survey of grids, and it was like 76% said they used some renewable, but that's different from 76% renewable implies 76% of the overall electricity is renewable. So I just caution people in Bitcoin, don't be sloppy about this issue and don't be opportunistic, because then your opponents will easily get you. Just embrace the energy, and you can also embrace the innovation aspect, but embrace it as an innovation aspect, and don't be ashamed of fossil fuels with Bitcoin, because you shouldn't be ashamed in your own life. Like everyone today who chooses to live in the wealthy world is choosing to live a fossil fueled life. Like the book is called Fossil Future, but it implies fossil present, right? I mean, we are going to have a fossil future to some degree. I hope we have more of one than less, because if we have less of one, we're going to be a lot poorer. But fossil fuels are good. So people should be excited and proud about it. And the prouder you are of Bitcoin, the prouder you should be of using fossil fuels to produce and use Bitcoin.
Well, you bring up some interesting points, because similar to the idea of looking at global warming, you acknowledge that the world is getting warmer. The Bitcoiners say, yes, Bitcoin does use a lot of energy. But at the same time, how do you look at, what that energy use is for and what are the sources? Because with Bitcoin specifically, one of my favorite analysts, Lynn Alden, she has pointed out that its energy use on a global level is literally a rounding error, because globally, when scientists go to measure how much energy was used, they can be off by several, percentages in one direction or another. So that's a rounding error. It's literally a rounding error in that Bitcoin uses less than 1/10 of 1% of energy, but it still consumes a lot. And we need to, I think, address things like you mentioned. Out there are statistics that say it's 60 to 70%. I think the Mining Council has put out information like that. And I'm not sure how accurate that tends to be. But one of the narratives that I think is very powerful is this idea that as renewable sources are built out, the wind farms, the solar farms, that energy is intermittent, and Bitcoin mining can come in and sort of be that excess capture.
I mean, maybe the general point in life I think is very important, is just we always need to be aware when we're looking for, we wish certain things were true. And so there's a lot of things with the renewable narrative in Bitcoin. I get why Bitcoin people wish that this were true. There's an appeal of it, because if Bitcoin can actually be the salvation of solar and wind, then it's easy and then it's not going to be opposed. But if you just think about how Bitcoin actually works, people spend just unbelievable amounts of money on equipment, and they're constantly upgrading equipment. So are they really going to just not use their equipment for huge amounts of time when there's insufficient solar and wind? I don't think so. This is not how it's actually going to work. So I just think people need to, I keep seeing like all kinds of sloppy kind of wishful analysis versus the actual thing. And you don't need it. Actually, people should focus on where are there the opportunities for innovation, and are there some for absorbing some solar and wind? Probably, but the stranded gas seems much more plausible to me. And really the development of like new remote things, that seems like the most exciting to me, because it's really like you can use Bitcoin to do proof of concept, and you're not, in a sense, you're not limited by your own place. So let's say like one of the exciting kinds of ideas that I hope materializes in the not too distant future is giant ships that serve as nuclear power plants that you can move around the world. Because nuclear is the only thing that has the density where you could just have a ship somewhere for like years and it could power a significant number of like homes and industrial facilities and stuff. So one cool thing would be to test that out, like using Bitcoin somewhere, using Bitcoin mining equipment. So there's a lot of exciting stuff, but it's just so damaging. The credibility is just so important, and it's easy to be at the front end of things when people haven't explored it. It's kind of easy to just jump onto things. This happens in my field too. There are a lot more people now who are arguing what I argue than there were when I got started. I'm really happy to have influenced a lot of them. But like people say things all the time on Twitter that are consistent with my views, so-called, that I do not post because there's like lots and lots of sloppy stuff. So for example, like there are these negative stories about like, oh, EVs are banned in this country for winter or something. And it's like, you look into it and that's not what it is. And so I'm just giving you an example. For me, I have an amazing researcher, Stefan, who's in Germany, and he knows all the European stuff, but he's also like, one of his main roles is just to make sure I never say anything wrong. And he's saved my ass like so many times. But now I was already congenial to this, to this idea of being like rigorous in terms of facts, but now it's just discipline. Like we don't say anything until he's gone over it. And he's super rigorous. And even though we totally agree on the fundamentals, like he has no temptation to say like for a convenient fact. Like we have to accept things. We have to accept the facts. And if we're right, there will be a lot of stories reinforcing what we say, but we can't just jump on these things that are opportunistic if they're not true. And, you look at what people say about me, it's very rare anyone has criticized me factually, like very, very rare. I can count 2 with Fossil Future, maybe 3, and I publicly admitted anytime I've been wrong. But I think that's what people in the Bitcoin world should aspire to, because you're saying like, we believe in honest money, like there's an unprecedented honesty in the accounting. Just be careful about opportunistic quote unquote facts.
No, I agree. I think we have to be very rigorous, especially when it comes to discussing energy and the sources that are used for Bitcoin mining. So let's talk a little bit about what's next, because it seems like we need more energy as a world, but we're moving in the direction in terms of policy that is maybe moving us toward more expensive, if not less energy.
Yeah.
So how do we get people, it seems like we're sort of on the far side of global warming, climate, all of its disaster, apocalypse. How do we get people more just toward the middle?
What would the middle mean?
To weighing both the benefits and the side effects, as opposed to just being so negative that the world is about to end because of global warming.
So I would think of it as we want people to be more even-handed. I just kind of rebel when people say the middle. It's like, well, if there's a totally false view and a totally true view, like I don't want them to compromise into a half false, half true view. But I do think this idea of being if you mean by the middle, like being even-handed,
right.
Yeah, I mean, it's an obvious thing, but we need to talk about this explicitly. Like this is a lot of what I do when I present in my book and when I talk and when I have conversations. Like I'll very quickly bring up, hey, don't you agree? We need to carefully weigh the benefits and the side effects, just like we would for a prescription drug. And it's very, very powerful because basically it frames people's thinking in a way that is common sense, but not common practice. So the way 99.9% of people thinking about fossil fuels will tend, at least that they've been exposed to mainstream stuff, will tend to look far more at negative side effects than benefits. But none of those people virtually think that is a good idea. Like if I just said to like Joe or something like that, hey Joe, do you agree we should carefully weigh the benefits and side effects, or do you think we should just look at negative side effects? What's he going to say? He's going to say, I believe we should carefully weigh them. And if somebody thinks that explicitly, they'll actually be more likely to do it. So it's one of these things where people don't even realize what they're doing and not doing. So making it explicit is good. And it's the same reason I talk about like delicate nurturer versus wild potential and parasite polluter versus, I didn't use it today, but like producer improver view of human beings, and advancing human flourishing, or like versus eliminating human impact. Like I'm very big on how things are framed and really giving people ways of thinking, including assumptions and values, that make sense to them, but that they didn't think about before. And so that's like a lot of what I'm trying to do is overall people ask, like, what are you trying to do? It's really, I'm trying to change our way of thinking about energy from an anti-human way to a pro-human way. And part of doing that is I need to be a master of all the facts, but sort of at the core, what I'm doing is I'm reframing. Like I'm giving people a different way of thinking about it. That's why like I was sort of a philosopher first, but an energy expert second. Like there's no way to persuade people unless you really know all the facts. But the most important thing is the reframing of the thinking.
Well, there's that saying that you can't let a good crisis go to waste, right? So right now, in many of the news outlets that exist, climate is a crisis, and it's one that we need to tackle immediately with ESG policies. Right. You see corporations, you mentioned, I think it was Apple in your book, that's actually buying credits, essentially. They're not renewable and they're not sustainable, but they're purchasing credits in order to essentially claim that they're 100% renewable.
It's very common. Yeah, everyone does. Everyone who claims 100% renewable is lying. That's just, you just take that as an absolute. Because, well, A, they're using a lot of things that aren't electricity, that are definitely powered by fossil fuels. But what they're doing with the 100% renewable claim in particular is they pay the grids to give them credit for the solar and wind others use and give others the blame for the coal and gas and nuclear that they use.
So rich people in these corporations will essentially be able to say that they're not polluting and they're not emitting CO2 when they actually are.
Like, why can't you be like us?
And they're relying more and more on other countries. I've also heard fantastic investigative journalist that I interviewed, Whitney Webb. She talked about nature, I believe, asset corporations, NACs. Have you heard of that? I might be getting the acronym wrong, but essentially where they're going to be creating on the stock market these companies that are going to be mining, the ocean, and you can now invest in that. And meanwhile, they're just going to dig up the whole earth, and that's going to be financialized. Do you have any take on that?
Well, I would need to know the details. I mean, I think we need to make much more. I think the ocean is just this amazing frontier that we're not using at all. I talk about this a bit in chapter 9 of Fossil Future on aquaculture and mariculture. So we make a bit of the use of the ocean with aquaculture and fisheries and stuff like that. But the ocean is most of the earth, and it's amazing. And there's lots of stuff there, and most of it is dead. Like we could create so much more life and they've done experiments. Like there's an experiment I talk about where, they vastly increased the salmon population just by putting, certain elements in the ocean. So I think we can make the ocean a much more alive place. And then if then I think you can mine it as well. I mean, I think I'm in favor of drilling there. It's like, I think we should be enjoying the ocean a lot more. And this is somebody who's like, I'm obsessed with the ocean. I go in the ocean all the time. I like sort of spend all my money to live on the beach. So, but yeah, no, I think we should be making much more of the ocean. So this person seems like there might be hostility to that. That can be done in bad ways. But in general, the ocean is this unexplored frontier.
No, it's more so just the idea of, say, corporations and governments having more access or making certain decisions, concentrating power and control over natural resources, as opposed to allowing the free market to decide, what's best and what's most prosperous for people. So kind of where I want to end it is, where do we go from here? Because reading your book, especially at the very end, you have a lot of hope. You think we're actually going to end up going in the right direction to a more abundant world. Why do you feel that way, and how do we get there?
I think we can. I mean, that's the thing. I think we can. So I think it's, so what convinces me is kind of, a lot of it is just my own work and success persuading people, which is I haven't seen, like I've been at this for a while and I feel like I'm getting better at it. And the arguments I'm using are getting better. And I haven't mentioned yet, I have a resource called energytalkingpoints.com. And one of the big goals of that is to give everyone all the resources they need to persuade people, themselves first, but then other people, because it has every issue you can imagine. You can just search on that website. And there's like a Twitter length way of explaining the issue and giving facts and stuff. So I feel like I'm a very big believer. I guess one of my core beliefs is that explanation is very unexplored. like that our ability to explain things as human beings is still pretty primitive. And I'm very interested in what I call intellectual persuasion, which is how do you persuasively explain something to somebody who expects to disagree. And so what happens is when I don't succeed, I always assume that I can explain it better. And I think a lot of people who are in activism, they kind of just want to say their thing. And if they feel it's true, they want to say it. And then if enough people don't agree, they're just like, oh, nobody's going to listen to me. And I just kind of will always think about there's a better way, there's a better way, there's a better way. Like I had a best-selling book, Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and I just totally redid it and took much longer. And a lot of people thought this is crazy, but I'm like, I know I can do a much better book that's much more persuasive. And so far, that's effective. And so I just think that the arguments that I'm making are very true. And I think that I and others will come up with better and better ways of making them. And then also, since the book came out, or since it was published, we've had this energy crisis. And I mentioned at the end of Fossil Future, reality is going to be an ally here, because the reality is these green policies cannot work in the way that people expect. And so once people are impoverished by them, what is that going to be like? Like, people can like these ideas in theory, but they really like them because they think it's free. They think it's free to like get net zero, and they think it's free to oppose fossil fuels. But once you see, no, wait, there's a huge cost because fossil fuels have these amazing benefits, then you really start to think about it. So I think you mentioned the crisis. You don't want to waste the crisis. Like the climate crisis is a manufactured crisis. The energy crisis is a real crisis. And I believe we shouldn't intellectually waste this crisis because this is something that's really affecting people. And when there's a crisis, people are open to the possibility that the establishment is wrong, because the establishment almost by definition created the crisis. And you'll see this with the Bitcoin world, where now that we see visible inflation, right? Like people are much more open to the problems of fiat currency. The other thing that the Bitcoin world did well that I've learned from, and I think I've done well in my own way, although not as successfully as the Bitcoin world, is they really offered a positive alternative, not just criticism of the establishment. So you think about, because again, I've been in the world of free market, Austrian economics, objectivism for, I don't know, it's like 22 years now or something like this, 24 years, I guess. And like, I was always against fiat money, but nobody cared about this. And then 5 years ago, suddenly everyone is talking about fiat money. Like I hear it on the Tim Ferriss show and these mainstream things.
Right.
But it's because Bitcoin had this positive alternative that the gold standard never really had. And in part, it was this thing that you could participate in individually. I mean, in part, people saw it as a money-making opportunity. And that helps. I don't have one of those with fossil fuels, unfortunately. But it's also just like you can help improve the world by doing this new thing. And my version of that is just having fossil fuels and a fossil future is this very positive thing. And that is what I believe. So I believe it's not just, oh, the anti-fossil fuel movement is bad. It's, no, fossil fuels have already made the world amazing, and it can be even more amazing. So that's why the subtitle is why global human flourishing, like it's global human flourishing. That's something we don't have, but something that we could have requires more oil, coal, and natural gas, not less. So I think the combination of better and better explanation, having a crisis that's bringing people's attention, and then having a positive alternative, I think all of those can, like, I don't know the level at which I know of no limit to where I and others can succeed. So if you don't know of a limit, then why would you stop?
Well, Bitcoiners put a huge focus on the idea of property rights, and you just made me think of something that was in your book, how American property rights are, and the fact that the reason we had fracking is because of our unique laws and freedom that we do have, but that might be under threat right now, right?
Might be. I mean, it's under threat certainly everywhere in the realm of industry. And it's because the green movement is inherently an anti-property rights movement. Because if you believe in minimizing or eliminating impact, that you cannot like what people do with private property. Because people use their private property to make their life better, which means specifically they make their land better. And you don't make your land better by doing nothing to it, right? Even if you want to enjoy the beauty of it, you do something to it and you build roads to it. And often you build these things called houses, right? We need dwellings and stuff. So the green movement cannot abide people having a right to private property. And they've done a lot to destroy that, including things like the Endangered Species Act, which is a whole discussion of what to do properly. But the way it functions is you can just declare anyone's land a habitat for endangered species, and then they don't have the property. anymore. You don't, like in the old days, if you really cared about this species, you had to buy it. You actually had to get people together who cared about it and buy it. But now it's just, oh, no, I think Natalie has this property. I think this sage grouse is really important. And so she can't build a house on it. And that's considered, okay. So yeah, the green movement is hugely violating property rights. And in particular, in the realm, Peter Thiel would call it like the realm of atoms versus bits. Like there's this whole thing where if you're against impact, you're against atoms. Like you're against actually physically doing things. And you sort of relegate yourself to this digital world, which Bitcoin is interesting because it sort of got away with it for a while. But then people realize, wait a second, the digital world depends on the atoms, right? They depend on the energy. And that's what's happened with the software companies too. People realize, oh, they're using energy. And the software company's immediate solution is let's just lie. Let's just say that we're 100% renewable and everyone else is using the coal and the gas. And I'm saying Bitcoin shouldn't make that mistake because that's not an ethical thing to do and it's not going to work. Anyway.
Well, your shirt says, I love fossil fuels, but we talked, a little bit about all these different energy sources, including nuclear, which I know you're a proponent of. So based on all of your expertise and research, if you think of the most abundant, prosperous world, what percentage would you say would come from fossil fuels versus nuclear if we really harnessed it versus renewables like solar and wind versus hydro? I mean, how would you break down that pie?
I wouldn't. Because I'm not a statist. But also there's a question of when. Because like the when is a really important question because people like to build things in their mind of like, well, because if I were to answer it abstractly, I would, independent of time, I'd say nuclear. Like we'll figure out a way to harness the atom with fission or maybe at some point fusion. And then it'll just sort of, everything will be super cheap and we'll be able to manufacture synthetic fuel that's just as good as oil or better than oil. And then, so like theoretically, I would just take the thing with the most raw potential, which would be the thing with the highest energy density that's stored, and then abundance. And so that would obviously be some form of nuclear. But yeah, and so sometimes people say like, Alex, why didn't you write a book about nuclear? And I probably will at some point. But the thing is, the fate of the world does not depend on nuclear right now. I mean, you'd say nuclear weapons and stuff, like we need nuclear weapons to defend ourselves. But like the fate of the world depends on fossil fuels. Because fossil fuels are what actually make the world an amazing place and what are absolutely needed for the foreseeable future. So my own love of nuclear technology and excitement about it, I love it in terms of its basic physics more than fossil fuels. Why wouldn't I? Because they're more powerful. Like the chemistry of fossil fuels is not as powerful as the like nuclear physics of nuclear energy. But it's like what actually matters for human flourishing by far the most now and for the foreseeable future. So for my life and people I care about, and just for the rest of the world, is fossil fuels. So that's why. And in terms of I don't want to dictate it at all because when is that nuclear future going to be? 100 years, 200 years? All I want to do is have the policies that make it as fast as possible for the best energy sources to win. And I made this very public last week. I had something on end preferences for unreliable electricity. I'm not anti-solar and wind. I'm against forced solar and wind, and I'm against solar and wind that is allowed to non-compete, basically, to unfairly compete by selling unreliable electricity, and we have to pay the same price as we do for reliable electricity. So I'm totally in favor of people trying to combine solar and wind with batteries and natural gas if they can, but I believe they need to do it on a free market without coercing us. So it's yes, I love fossil fuels. You can love more than one thing. But this is the thing that most needs to be loved right now.
If you can summarize for me in one sentence, what's the one thing that you wish you knew about this whole industry before you started studying it? What would it be?
Probably that it makes us unnaturally safe from climate to use fossil fuels. It's maybe not the most fundamental fact, but it's sort of the most mind-changing fact. Because it sort of gets you at, well, fossil fuels have these fundamental benefits, and they particularly have benefits in the area they're supposed to make the world worse. So it's like the thing they're supposed to ruin, they actually make amazing. And so that's like a real mind shift once you get that. And one way is to put it is fossil fuels didn't take a safe climate and make it dangerous. They took a dangerous climate and made it safe.
Yeah, that's that delicate nurturer argument, which I found so interesting. Okay, to kind of summarize, for those out there that may be watching and they go, Alex, you make some interesting points, but I want to make sure that this is a beautiful planet 100 years from now? I'm not buying everything you're selling. I do want fewer emissions, and I want the policies that will move us toward fewer emissions. What's your biggest takeaway for them?
I mean, my biggest takeaway is if you want a beautiful planet in 100 years or in 50 years, you're going to need more CO2 emissions for the foreseeable future. If you want a beautiful planet and lower emissions, you need more freedom. You need particularly to liberate the most promising alternatives, because the only way you're actually going to get lower emissions in a world that needs more energy, you're not going to get it by punishing us and making our lives worse, because that doesn't change what China will do, what Russia will do, what India will do. Like, many people will properly use the most cost-effective thing. So the thing we have most leverage over is, do we have the liberty to have new cost-effective things? So nuclear, for example, has this potential. Do we liberate that potential more quickly so that it's actually globally cost competitive? So I think the key to any kind of pro-human emissions reduction is liberating cost competitive alternatives. But I would tell them to really appreciate, like, if you want a beautiful planet, like, you got to recognize today's planet is the most beautiful planet, including you get to enjoy it more. And there are a lot of people who want to enjoy it more. And so I would just, of course I can say, go read Fossil Future, at least go to energytalkingpoints.com. But like, it is really important that you not think of a beautiful planet as an unimpacted planet. That's a pretty miserable planet. And if there were no humans, there'd be nobody to think even of it as beautiful at all. So like, a beautiful planet is one where we are prosperous and we have a lot of energy to have machines do stuff for us, including we can enjoy all the places on this planet. So I would just like, we want a human-friendly planet, and that is a beautiful planet.
All right, Alex, what's something that you wish I asked you that I haven't asked you?
Well, we didn't. I dodged the question about hydrocarbon products. So that's the thing.
You want to tell us all the things that oil is in?
Well, this one. Well, this kind of it is. This was the first thing that really captivated me, about oil, and it's actually the first thing I could find that anyone else was interested in. Where it was just, I learned that, wait a second, not only does oil power all of these things that I don't think of it power, I get just, I thought of it, it powers my car and stuff, but I didn't realize, it powers all the machines around the world that are doing all of this kind of amazing work. Like, it's allowing me to have affordable food and this kind of thing. But it's actually or natural gas is in everything. And I remember I used to do this exercise myself, and I would teach about it, called an oil walk. And I would just think through my whole day, like walk through my day, and where was I using oil? Like, I wake up in the morning and it's like, this is back when we had alarm clocks, and we have an alarm clock, and like put it to my hand to shut it off. And I'm like, wondering, why don't I get electrocuted by this thing? And it's because it's got this cable that's insulated. Hey, what's that made of? Is that made of glass? Is it made of rock? Like, wait, it's made of that stuff that we saw in the oil spill? Like, it's actually made of oil. And then you go in the shower and that's oil. And you go in your refrigerator and that's oil. And the carpet is made of oil. And the insulation is made of oil. And the paint is made of oil. And the ink. And then you have all this oil in your car that's not even the gasoline in your car, but all the plastic in your car and all these synthetics and these things that keep you safe. And you just realize, oh my gosh, not only are fossil fuels this uniquely versatile source of energy, they're this uniquely versatile material, and we don't appreciate that either. Right. Like, the word plastic now is viewed as negative, but plastic is incredibly positive. It really just means things that we transform to be better. So it's like, it's the same theme of, do you look at things from a human flourishing perspective where you embrace human impact done intelligently, or do you have this hostility toward human impact and you just think everything we do is bad? And I call this, like, I mean this very literally, I call this human racism, this mentality, because the idea is everything the human race does is bad and everything the rest of nature does is good. And this is like a very low self-esteem as a species, where we think of minimizing human impact as the highest good. Can you imagine a lion that thought this way? Like, minimizing lion impact? Like, you could never sell a lion on this, or a bear on minimizing bear impact. And if somebody said, I want to minimize bear impact, you'd think that they wanted to kill all the bears, right? So what does it mean when our species says minimize human impact?
Well, why would we go for this? Psychologically, as a philosopher, why would we say, yeah, that's actually a good idea? We need to minimize our impact. The earth is more important.
Well, I know you're trying to wrap up, so this is a big question, but I'll give you a quick answer to it. And part of it, there's a lot in chapter 3 of Fossil Future, but the psychological dimension I don't really talk about in the book. But it's kind of this question: how can humans have anti-human ideas? Like, why would humans have anti-human ideas? And I think the most straightforward answer is sometimes it makes us feel superior to other humans to have an anti-human idea, or it makes us feel less inferior. So you think the obvious example is like, well, racism is an anti-human idea, right? Because it's saying certain people with certain external characteristics, like they're not really human and we're human, right? So black individuals aren't human, Jews they're not truly human, like this kind of thing. And kind of there, it's obvious there's a motive of, the people in the other category they want unearned superiority. So they love the idea of, these people, like, I don't need to do anything to be good. I just happen to have this wonderful skin color. And that's like, there's that kind of thing. But this exists in other realms too. So what about the worship of the hatred of the 1%? I was mentioning Occupy Wall Street, like we condemn the 1%. But that's really an anti-human idea if you think about it, because those 1% make our lives amazing. Like those are the Steve Jobses of the world. And, but yet we have this idea the 1% are bad, and partially it makes people feel superior. Or even communism. Like people like communism as an idea, even though it clearly just makes people poor, if not dead. But part of it is people like the idea of, I want to be equal. I don't want anyone to be better than I am. And so with the green thing, part of it is, if you believe that human impact is bad, then you are superior to the most productive and prosperous people if you're just kind of a regular person or a loser. And I've been at a lot of climate rallies and stuff, and you can see this kind of mediocre mentality that just has a lot of hatred and a lot of envy. So there's one kind of mentality that says, hey, those people are achieving a lot, I admire them. But another is, I don't like the way that those successful people make me feel, so I like an idea that makes me superior by doing nothing and makes them inferior by doing a lot. And notice the idea of minimizing impact, literally the best thing is nothing. And you're actually a hero if you kill yourself. Like you're really, that's like the noble thing. That's like the ultimate, like he killed himself for the earth. What a beautiful thing. Like that, but that's the logical thing, right? That's the most heroic thing to do. And what people do in practice is they fly around a lot of private jets, but they justify it by saying, well, I'm going to offset other people's emissions by more than my jet used, which basically means I'm going to kill a lot of other people.
Right.
So those are actually the heroes, is the people who have killed the most human beings. And I know it sounds crazy, but this is the logic of it. And we're seeing the logic play out mostly by taking away people's energy in the name of, quote, the climate, even though the energy has made us far safer from climate. If you take away people's energy, climate is going to start mass murdering us again.
It is remarkable just to see some of the hypocrisy and to see that we've moved away from common sense and truly from that idea of science that you touched on earlier, to be fair and to weigh the benefits with the negative side effects. So, Alex, this has been, I don't know how long we've gone, but this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. Anything else in terms of where you want to send people? I know you mentioned your book, energytalkingpoints.com, anywhere else?
energytalkingpoints.com. I would recommend people can get the book in a lot of formats at fossilfuture.com. And I always forget to mention this, but I'm sure you have some students and educators. They can actually get it for free. So they can just get a free copy, totally free, at fossilfuture.com. So I don't want to forget about that. And then I'm on social media, but particularly I'm on Twitter, although Elon has gotten to banning people that he doesn't like. And I've already been blocked by him. So who knows how long I'll be on that.
Elon Musk blocked you?
Yeah, a long time ago, for saying the Tesla was a really good fossil fuel car.
Wow. See, you make me want to just keep going with this stuff.
I know, I have more than 2 hours of material apparently.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, he may be stepping down from Twitter, may have stepped down by the time this is released. But, Elon Musk, it's just interesting just to note, just to wrap up, I worry about us having heroes in any industry in general.
I've seen you mention this before.
In fossil fuels, in technology, in policy. I don't believe that we should have heroes or cling on to someone, especially someone as powerful. But any thoughts that you want to share with people, given the fact that he is in the headlines so much recently with regards to Twitter, censorship, Twitter files? A lot of people think what he's doing is really, really great because it's allowing for information that was maybe suppressed or censored before to actually see the light of day. Others say he's censoring and he's against freedom of speech. Any final takes?
I think I'm more interested in the hero issue actually, but I think he's a very mixed bag. And I think part of the people like to have binary. Like, I think there are heroes. I don't think he's one, nor do I think he's a totally consistent villain. Like some people think of these like a very mixed bag. And I think in this realm, I think it's clear he did not think through at all like this idea of a free speech platform. He just had this vague idea in his head. And because as soon as he actually had to deal with the reality of how you actually deal with content on a platform, you can't just have everyone say whatever they want unless you have some really good curation mechanism. Like, what did he do? He immediately just started selling blue checks, which I think has been, anyone who has had a blue check, nobody wants to talk about this, but it's terrible. Like your verified thing, it just got ruined. And there's just like he's just doing all these random things. And now, he started like banning the Facebook mentions and the Mastodon mentions. So you can just see like, this is not it, but it's, again, he's not like a total villain. I think he is trying to do some good things, but I think he in particular is a dangerous person to deify. But my own take on the hero thing is because, like, I don't know how people will take this, but like, I try to be the hero that never lets people down. Like, that's a personal goal of mine. I'm not telling anyone to hero worship me, but like, I do think a lot about really being like a good person in general, and then what I am doing in particular, and even things like the fact checking, like really being, I think part of it is really, I don't even think it's that hard if you have fully thought through what you want in life and human motivation. So I think if people really think through the concept of human flourishing, and that's what they really want, there's a lot of things that people are tempted by that will not be very tempting, like having just massive political power, or having massive money as an end in itself, or having like people worship you. Like you start, and I highly recommend, by the way, The Fountainhead. If people haven't read that, I think that's the best self-help book ever written. Like if you look at, have you read The Fountainhead before? Like if you, like Howard Roark, I think you can learn so much from him in terms of what do you want out of life? And he wants a life where he's creating the things that he wants on his own terms. And, he gets to be with somebody he loves and he wants friends and stuff. But he like wants a life of independent creation. And I'm very convinced myself that this is the most desirable type of life. Like I do not desire to have Elon Musk's life. Like I want my stuff to be more influential, but I don't want a fundamentally different type of life, nor do I want a life where I'm dealing with anything but the truth. And so I think that's why I have confidence. And I feel like, if people like follow me, they won't be disappointed because I have very selfish reasons for being a good person. And that's like that's when I trust people, if they have selfish reasons for doing the right thing. And I do believe in selfishness fundamentally, but rational selfishness.
Yeah.
And not exploiting others.
No, that's interesting. I mean, especially bringing up the Ayn Rand's takes on that as well. And Bitcoin, I think, turns greed on its head. It turns it into something that's beneficial for everybody and creates more abundance. And maybe we'll talk another time about Elon Musk, because I do think all of it is interesting. His entire industry is very subsidized by the government, obviously. And we do kind of offer up a lot of power to people that have so much wealth. And we maybe listen to them a little bit more than we might someone that doesn't have a huge following or doesn't have a ton of wealth, but maybe has a lot of knowledge. And so it's all very interesting. But Alex, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for checking out this show. Again, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any new content. And I love to hear your feedback. Leave a comment or send me an email at natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. Let me know what you think, if you have guest suggestions, and I'll see you next time.